The first warning came as a sound low, distant and endless. By the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. The storm was moving faster than the trains, swallowing towns by the hour and heading straight for New York. Within hours, daylight itself vanished. The sky turned white, then grey, then black, and the wind began to scream a sound that carried death on its back. By nightfall, the city was trapped. Bridges vanished into nothingness, the streets filled with frozen silhouettes. Men collapsed in snowdrifts that reached the second floor, while horses froze mid-stride, their reins turned to glass. No one could reach anyone. No telegrams, no rescue. Only the sound of wind and the slow creak of dying fires. If you can hear me now, stay close. Don't forget to like this story and tell me where you're listening from tonight, because what you're about to hear isn't just a blizzard. It's the moment New York met its own extinction. It began with a hum so faint it might have been imagined, a kind of trembling in the air, as though the city itself were holding its breath. That morning, the sky over Manhattan looked bruised and pale, a sheet of pewter pressed low against the rooftops. Pigeons gathered in restless circles above the chimneys, then scattered, disappearing toward the river, as if fleeing something unseen. Even the river seemed uneasy, the Hudson's grey surface shifting without wind, muttering in small, broken waves against the piers. Down on Pearl Street, men unloading crates from a schooner stopped to listen. One thought he heard thunder, another said it was only the sound of wagons on Broadway. But thunder didn't linger like this, it pulsed, faint but steady, a vibration that seemed to live beneath the cobblestones. The city had known storms before, yet this was different. There was no rain, no lightning, just the feeling that something vast was stirring above the clouds, too large to name. By mid-morning, the air had changed. It felt heavier, as though each breath carried a hint of salt and iron. Telegraph wires overhead began to hum, the sound sharp and constant. Inside the Western Union office, operators exchanged glances as their instruments ticked and spat out nonsense dots and dashes forming no words. One clerk leaned close to his receiver, swore softly, and wrote in the margin of his logbook, "Barometer falling fast. March 12, 1888. Across the harbor, sailors standing watch on the decks of anchored ships watched their compasses twitch without reason. The horizon had vanished into a dull white haze. Somewhere, out to sea, a steamer blew its horn twice, then again, its sound swallowed by the fog. At the Battery, children pressed their faces to the frozen railings, laughing at the first flakes of snow that began to fall thin, hesitant, drifting down like ash from an unseen fire. Inside a tenement on Mulberry Street, a seamstress looked up from her work and frowned. The light through her window had gone strangely dim, though it was not yet noon. She rubbed her arms, feeling a sudden chill creep into the room. The candle flame beside her guttered sideways, though every window was closed. It was as if the air itself had begun to move differently, thick and slow, whispering through the walls. By early afternoon, shopkeepers along Broadway were stepping outside to look up. The sound was clearer now, a moan beneath the clouds that came and went like breathing. It seemed to roll through the city in waves up the avenues, across the rooftops, into every crack between brick and bone. A newspaperman near City Hall muttered that it reminded him of the wind that comes before a hurricane. Another said it was only March weather, but the old dockworkers shook their heads. They'd heard this before once, years ago, before the sea iced over and took 3 ships in a single night. The whispering didn't stop, it deepened, it grew into a kind of language the city couldn't understand, one that spoke of things still hours away. And as evening crept closer, the lamps flickered to life one by one, their flames bending toward the east, drawn by a wind that hadn't yet arrived. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, slow and uneven, its echoes carried through the mist like a warning that no one would hear until it was far too late. That was how it began, the blizzard that would bury New York alive. Not with thunder or rain, but with a whisper from the sky, and a silence that followed too long after. By late morning, The city had gone strangely still. The hum that had haunted the sky since dawn began to fade, leaving behind a silence so deep that even the clatter of horseshoes seemed swallowed by it. The snow, which had started as a faint, playful dust, now thickened into sheets that drifted sideways instead of down. Each flake was heavy, wet, and fast, blurring the streets until the world dissolved into grey. From the harbour to Harlem, the air felt wrong, like standing in the pause before a scream. On Canal Street, carts rattled faster than usual, drivers urging their horses on before the storm grew worse. But the horses fought their reins, hooves slipping on slush that turned instantly to ice. Every sound, the creak of axles, the calls of vendors, the hammering of shoemakers seemed muffled, as though wrapped in wool. Even the church bells, usually sharp and certain, rang weakly, their tones drifting into the whiteness and vanishing there. Inside the coffeehouses along Broadway, men in overcoats shook snow from their shoulders and muttered about the weather. They spoke of the barometer readings printed that morning, strangely low for March, and of a sudden gale spotted off New Jersey. "It'll pass," someone said. "Always does." But outside the windows, the wind began to turn corners that had never known wind before, bending lamplight until it shimmered and broke like glass. In the upper stories of the city's new brownstones, servants moved from room to room, shuttering windows that groaned against the mounting gusts. Curtains flared inward, though every latch was fastened tight. In one parlor on Madison Avenue, a woman paused at her piano as the draft extinguished 3 candles in a row. She relit them, her hands trembling, and for the first time realized she could no longer hear the streetcars below. Down near the river, the fog thickened until the ferries vanished entirely. Dock hands, unable to see their own ropes, tied them blind. The water turned black, then white again, as sheets of ice swept in from the upper Hudson like invading armies. A captain standing at the bow of his vessel swore he saw shapes moving within the storm, figures, pale and tall, walking across the ice toward Manhattan. He blinked, and they were gone. By noon, the city's rhythm had broken. Office clerks abandoned their desks to watch the snow from stairwell windows. Street vendors huddled beneath awnings that tore loose one by one. Newspapers, discarded and unread, skated across the cobblestones until they froze mid-drift, half buried in snow. Children, thrilled at first, ran shrieking through the drifts until their laughter turned to coughs and their cheeks burned raw. Mothers shouted them inside, voices thin against the wind. Then came the moment no one noticed until it was too late. The birds stopped flying. The sky, once crowded with fluttering shapes, stood empty. The silence that followed pressed on every eardrum until even breathing seemed intrusive. A delivery boy paused in the street. His wool cap rhymed with frost, and realized he couldn't hear the city at all. No hooves, no wheels, no voices. Just the faint hiss of falling snow. For one long minute, the great heart of New York ceased to beat. Then, from somewhere near the East River, came a single, drawn-out crack, the sound of ice splitting under pressure, and the wind roared to life. Shutters banged open. Lanterns swung from their hooks. Somewhere uptown, a man shouted that the telegraph lines had gone down, but his words were lost in the sudden, furious howl that rushed through every street at once. The silence had ended, and the nightmare had begun. All across the city, the instruments began to fail. In newspaper offices, the weather clerks stared at their dials, tapping the glass as the needles slid downward into numbers they'd never seen. It was just after noon when the last of them gave up and wrote a note across the bottom of the chart. Pressure still falling. Fast. In the telegraph station on Broadway, the air smelled of ozone. Wires crackled overhead, their current pulsing erratically. Operators sat at their desks, faces lit by the faint blue glow of the machines, watching dots and dashes turn into gibberish. One man tried to send a warning westward to Trenton, to Philadelphia, but the key spat back only static. The line to Washington was gone. The city's voice, once carried through miles of copper wire, had been cut. At the docks, Sailors leaned into the wind that rolled down from the north. The tide was wrong, it rose too fast, then dropped again without pattern. A long, eerie groan came from beneath the wharves as the timbers strained. One ship, a small cargo steamer called the March Queen, slipped her moorings and began to drift, her ropes frozen solid where they touched the bollards. By the time men noticed, she was already vanishing into a white curtain that erased the horizon. In the weather office near Battery Park, young clerks moved between instruments with pencils in their mouths, recording what they could. The senior observer, an old man with shaking hands, whispered to himself that it reminded him of the main storm of '72, but worse. The temperature was falling by the minute. He reached for the telephone to warn the city's newspapers, but stopped halfway. There was no signal. Even the wires of the new electric network hummed and flickered like dying nerves. Uptown, in brownstone parlors and crowded boarding houses, talk of the strange weather turned to unease. Fireplaces were stoked to their limit, but the draft carried more snow than heat. A reporter for The Sun stepped into the street to measure the snowfall, 8 inches already, and was nearly knocked off his feet by the wind. It came in bursts, twisting down the avenue with such force that he could see it sculpting the drifts before his eyes. By mid-afternoon, the snow no longer fell gently. It tore through the air like handfuls of ground glass. Windows along Fifth Avenue frosted over from the inside, trapping their own lamplight. Roof slates peeled up and flew like playing cards. On the rooftops, pigeons huddled together until the weight of snow forced them into the air, only to vanish into the blinding swirl. In the poorer quarters, people nailed blankets across doorframes and prayed the wind wouldn't find its way in. A woman in a fourth-floor tenement boiled the last of her potatoes, pressing her children close to keep them warm. Outside, the storm howled through the narrow alleys, scattering cinders and soot. The sound it made was not like wind anymore, it was deeper, heavier, as if the city were caught inside a living thing's lungs. Back at the Weather Bureau, the old observer looked one final time at the falling needle, then closed the glass case over it. The metal pointer trembled, dipped, and came to rest below the lowest mark on the scale. "Impossible," he murmured, but it wasn't. He stepped to the window, wiped the frost with his sleeve, and saw nothing, no sky, no river, no city, just a wall of white swallowing everything in sight. That was the moment he understood. This wasn't weather. This was siege. The barometers had fallen as far as they could go, and the blizzard of 1,888 had only just begun to breathe. By 3 in the afternoon, the air itself seemed to turn solid. The first real gust struck like a slap, scattering chimney soot into the snow that was already falling thick and fast. Within minutes, the streets vanished into an indistinct blur, walls, doors, and rooftops folding into one another until the entire city looked like it had been erased. The snow didn't fall straight down anymore. It spun sideways in whirls, rising in sudden bursts like smoke from invisible fires. On Broadway, carriages pulled to a halt as drivers shielded their eyes. Horses tossed their heads, foam freezing in their manes. Every hoofprint filled in instantly, as though the ground itself refused to remember movement. The wind carried the sharp scent of coal and salt, and beneath it, something faintly metallic, the smell of iron rails already freezing solid. The elevated train rattled once overhead, then stopped mid-track with a long groan, its cars swaying in the whiteness like stranded ghosts. Inside a newspaper office near Union Square, reporters crowded by the window, pressing their palms against the frosted glass. "You can't even see the lamppost," someone muttered. The editor, a stout man in shirt sleeves, looked over the latest wire dispatch, the last one before the lines failed completely. Unprecedented pressure drop. Gale warnings extended. Storm intensifying. He read it aloud, folded the paper once, and said quietly, "Gentlemen, we're off the map." Down by the harbor, sailors fought to tie down their vessels. The ropes cracked like whips in their hands, freezing the instant they hit the decks. One man was found hours later, half buried in snow, his fingers locked still around a cleat. The East River had begun to glaze over. chunks of ice slamming against the piers with the dull, steady rhythm of a beating drum. The foghorns moaned until even their sound was swallowed. At the corner of Bowery and Grand, a policeman leaned into the wind, his coat flapping like a flag in battle. He tried to cross the street, but found his legs trapped thigh-deep. Behind him, windows shattered as pressure built against the glass. Shopkeepers nailed boards over their storefronts while the wind screamed through every gap like a living thing. In the tenements, laundry froze stiff on the lines, transforming into pale, human-shaped shrouds that swayed against the brick walls. By dusk, the light had gone completely, though the sky still glowed with a strange, dim whiteness. The gas lamps flickered, their flames warped into thin, trembling needles. People who ventured outdoors tied ropes from their doors to nearby lampposts so they could find their way back. More than one never did. The storm no longer felt like weather, it felt like siege. A man in the Flatiron building tried to light his pipe by the window, but the draft drew the match out of his fingers and sent sparks flying. For a moment, he thought he saw faces in the snow, features forming, dissolving, reforming again in the whirl. He backed away slowly, heart hammering, and shut the blinds. Outside, the city howled. The storm had taken shape now. It moved with purpose, as if it had eyes and will. Snow swept through every alley and passageway, curling beneath doors and through cracks in the floorboards. It entered homes, climbed stairwells, muffled clocks. Even time itself seemed to slow beneath its weight. And through it all, the snow kept falling endless, weightless, soundless, rising from the ground as much as it fell from the sky. Smoke without fire, silence without peace. The kind of storm that did not merely pass, but planned to stay. By dawn on the second day, the East River had stopped moving. At first it seemed like mist rolling low across the surface, thin layers of white clinging to the waves. But as the light grew, the truth became visible. The water itself had turned solid. From the Brooklyn piers to the Manhattan docks, a crust of ice stretched across the current, broken only by the black mouths of half-frozen ferry slips. The river groaned as it hardened, deep and slow, like a creature in pain. Longshoremen stood at the edge and stared. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, a low thunder that came from beneath their boots. Every few minutes, the ice shifted, sending cracks racing outward like lightning under glass. A gull landed, hopped twice, then froze where it stood, wings still half spread. Men crossed themselves without knowing why. They said the East River hadn't frozen like this since the war, maybe longer. Down by Fulton Ferry, a small group of passengers huddled near the dockhouse, faces red and raw from the cold. The ferryman, an old veteran named Casey, refused to launch. "No current left to steer by," he said, his voice hoarse. "You cross now, you'll be statues by midstream." Some cursed him, demanding passage, but when one man threw a stone onto the ice and it failed to break, the anger turned to silence. The snow fell straight again, thick, heavy flakes drifting over the still water, softening the world into something unrecognizable. Across the river in Brooklyn, smoke rose from the chimneys of the Navy Yard. Workers tried to keep the furnaces alive, but the coal arrived late. The wagons trapped somewhere on the frozen bridges. Men carried sacks on their backs through waist-deep drifts, their breath rising in grey columns that joined the fog above. The wind knifed through every crack in the brick, cutting to the bone. When they looked toward Manhattan, they could see nothing but a white wall, no skyline, no harbor, no light, only the occasional shadow of a collapsed mast or a half-sunken barge caught in the ice. Inside a waterfront tavern, sailors thawed their hands over a single coal stove. Someone played a tune on a broken fiddle, but the strings snapped one by one in the cold. The barkeep poured whiskey into tin cups and muttered that the city had angered God himself. A few laughed, the way desperate men do. Outside, the wind howled through the rigging of frozen ships, making a sound that might have been laughter or mourning. By mid-morning, word spread that 2 ferries had gone missing, the Garden City and the Aurora. Both were last seen heading toward Manhattan before the river sealed itself shut. Families gathered along the shore, scanning the ice for shapes that might be wrecks, or worse. When the snow cleared briefly, someone spotted a dark form half buried in frost near the center of the channel. It was the Aurora, its upper deck tilted, the railings encased in glassy frost. The figures on board were motionless. Rescue teams tried to reach them, but the ice cracked and shifted underfoot. The men turned back, their lanterns swinging like tiny, helpless stars in the gray. As the day wore on, the river claimed everything: the ropes, the lifeboats, even the sound of the city itself. By nightfall, the East River looked like a road leading nowhere. People said they could hear it groaning still, deep under the ice, like something alive and furious trapped beneath the surface. Others swore they saw lights moving across it, ghost ferries gliding silently between the banks, carrying passengers who would never arrive. That night, the frozen river became the city's mirror, still, merciless, and waiting. And somewhere beneath it, the heartbeat of New York slowed to match the rhythm of the ice. By the second afternoon, Manhattan was no longer a city but a labyrinth of snow canyons. The wind had stopped pretending to be mere weather. It had become a living force, grinding through the avenues with the persistence of a tide. In the chaos, the carriages froze where they stood. Horses collapsed in their harnesses, their bodies steaming for a moment before turning still. Drivers, blinded by the white fury, abandoned their reins and stumbled into drifts that swallowed them whole. On Fifth Avenue, a procession of hansom cabs had tried to outrun the storm. The first made it as far as 24th Street before the wheels locked in the snow. Within minutes, the rest were trapped behind it, a line of black shapes fading into a wall of ice. The snow buried the wheels, then the doors, then the roofs, until the whole street looked like a row of small white hills. The horses beneath them stiffened mid-motion, their leather bridles frozen taut. Some said they still stood upright, encased like statues of salt. Inside one of those carriages, a banker and his wife huddled beneath fur blankets, convinced the storm would pass. The windows frosted over until they could no longer tell night from day. When the husband finally forced the door open, the snow was pressed against it like plaster. He dug with his gloved hands until they bled, but the wind filled every hole he made. Later, when rescuers found them, the clock inside the carriage was still ticking, stuck at 5:10. Downtown, the situation was no better. Wagons loaded with coal had stalled on the bridges, their drivers unable to see more than a few feet ahead. The animals lay side by side in the drifts, their harnesses twisted like ribbon. A grocer's cart overturned on Bowery, spilling apples that rolled across the frozen street before disappearing beneath the snow. The fruit froze where it lay, red dots scattered in the endless white, a small, strange beauty amid the ruin. In the poorer districts, people worked together to dig tunnels through the streets, connecting one tenement to another. Through these makeshift passageways, they passed what little food they had: bread, potatoes, anything that hadn't yet frozen solid. The tunnels were narrow and dark, lit only by candles that flickered in the drafts. Sometimes the ceiling collapsed, and the snow poured in like a suffocating tide. Still, they dug, because to stay still was death. At City Hall Park, the great equestrian statue of Washington was half buried. The snow had climbed to the horse's flanks, and the bronze face was crusted in ice. A few blocks away, a trolley lay derailed, its windows shattered, its passengers long vanished. Inside the cars, the seats were coated in frost, and the conductor's bell hung silent. It looked less like a train and more like an artifact, already ancient, a relic from a civilization swallowed by winter. As darkness fell, the storm found new voices. The wind moaned through the frozen reins and carriage wheels, turning the whole city into a kind of orchestra of ruin. The streets that had once echoed with the clatter of hooves now rang with a hollow music, iron groaning, wood splitting, glass shivering under the pressure. From the rooftops, those few who dared to look out saw nothing but a sea of white, undulating through the city's grid. No streets, no buildings, just drifts rising and falling like waves frozen mid-motion. Beneath that silent ocean lay hundreds of carriages, horses, and souls caught in their final journey, buried where they stood. And above it all, the wind kept singing a long, unbroken note that sounded almost human. By nightfall, the storm had found its full voice. The wind no longer howled, it roared, low and deep, with the force of 1,000 invisible hands clawing through the streets. It came from every direction at once, slamming doors, tearing shingles, hurling debris through the dark. What began as a snowfall had become something else entirely, a siege that wanted not only to bury the city, but to unmake it. On the Lower East Side, the roofs went first. They lifted in sudden bursts, whole sections peeling off like paper, vanishing into the swirl. Chimneys collapsed into the tenements below, sending bricks and soot crashing into rooms already cold and dark. Inside one of those rooms, a mother shielded her children beneath a table, her breath coming in white clouds as dust fell from the ceiling. Every few seconds came the sound of impact, wood against brick, slate against glass, and the slow growing creak of walls giving way. In the grander homes uptown, the wind found new ways to enter. It slipped through keyholes, under doors, through the seams of window panes. Curtains snapped like sails. Fires died one by one as downdrafts filled the hearths with snow. A mansion on Madison Avenue lost its upper story in a single instant, the roof blown clean off, a chandelier torn loose and dashed against the wall. The butler who went to fetch blankets was never seen again. They said the door had been ripped from its hinges and carried him out into the storm like a leaf. At the harbor, the ships moaned against their moorings. The John Inglis, a steamer bound for Albany, tore from its dock and spun sideways, grinding into another vessel with the sound of splitting timber. Crates burst open across the pier barrels, rope, bits of canvas all swept into the air like straw. A warehouse nearby lost its wall, exposing shelves of goods that rattled and clattered in the freezing wind until the entire structure folded in on itself. Even the great stone buildings trembled. The Metropolitan Life Tower swayed faintly, and the telegraph poles snapped one after another along Broadway, collapsing like dominoes into the drifts. Their wires twisted through the air in bright blue arcs, hissing, sputtering, dying. For a few seconds the whole city was lit by that brief, unearthly glow lines of electric fire tracing the wind's path through the dark. Then the light was gone, and the night returned, black and absolute. Somewhere near Gramercy Park, a man named Henry Morgan tried to hold his front door closed against the pressure. His wife screamed for him to let it go, but he pressed harder, both hands against the wood as it buckled inward. The sound it made was not a knock, but a heartbeat. When the door finally gave, it flew open with such force that it carried him backward across the room. The wind followed, filling the house in an instant, scattering papers, dragging curtains, extinguishing lamps. His wife later found him pinned beneath the fallen piano, his coat covered in snow. By midnight, the city sounded like it was tearing itself apart. Every gust brought new ruin walls collapsing, timbers splintering, glass raining down from unseen heights. The snow carried everything with it, splinters of furniture, feathers from pillows, fragments of people's lives, and spun them together into a blinding white torrent that erased the boundaries between earth and air. And yet, beneath the destruction, there was an eerie rhythm, almost musical, the pulse of a storm that breathed like a beast. Those who survived said the wind had a voice that night, low, mournful, endless. It tore down walls, but it also sang, and its song would echo through the bones of the city long after the storm had passed. Just before midnight, a strange quiet fell over the storm, not silence exactly, but a pause, as if the blizzard itself were taking a breath. Then, one by one, the telegraph lines began to die. It started in Brooklyn, where the wires along the bridge hummed faintly and sparked blue before going dark. Within minutes, the failure spread across the river, up Broadway, through City Hall, and into the hearts of every newsroom and railway station in Manhattan. The voice of the city, its wires, its pulse, its nervous system went still. In the Western Union building, clerks who had worked through the storm stood frozen before their instruments. The The familiar chatter of dots and dashes had slowed into nonsense hours ago, messages swallowed by static. Now, the machines were dead altogether. One operator, his fingers stiff with cold, tapped his key again and again, waiting for a response from Newark that would never come. The only answer was the sound of the storm pressing against the windows, low, steady, and endless. He tried the main trunk line north, then west, then south. Nothing. When he finally turned toward his supervisor, the man had already covered the machines with canvas and lit a small lamp. "That's it," he said softly. "New York's gone dark." Across town, in the newsroom of The Sun, editors argued over the front page that would never be printed. The presses downstairs had frozen hours earlier, their ink hardened inside the rollers. Reporters stared at their half-finished stories, weather reports from Albany, ship sightings off Long Island, all ending abruptly in the same last line. "Transmission lost." A junior copyist, no older than 17, whispered that he could still hear something on the line, a faint clicking like a heartbeat. The editor leaned close, listened, and shook his head. "That's not Morse," he said. "That's just the wind." Out in the streets, the telegraph poles swayed and bent under their burden of ice. The wires themselves hummed like strings on a giant harp, vibrating in the gale. Now and then they snapped with a sound like a gunshot, whipping through the air in wild arcs. One wire came down across a lamppost, lighting the snow with a brief flash before going dark forever. Those who saw it said it looked like lightning frozen in mid-air. The loss of the telegraph meant more than silence, it meant isolation. No train schedules could be sent, no ships warned, no messages of rescue or reassurance exchanged. The city had become an island again, cut off not by water but by white. Somewhere in the harbor, a captain shouted into his speaking tube for orders that would never arrive. In Brooklyn, a mother sat waiting for a telegram that her son was safe in Manhattan. In Manhattan, the son wrote a message to tell her the same, unaware that both messages were trapped in the same dead line. By 2 in the morning, the last surviving connection sputtered out in a burst of blue light. The operator who witnessed it said the spark leapt between the wires and formed a small, glowing ring before fading away. For an instant, it illuminated the room, catching the faces of the men watching in silence, their expressions not of fear, but disbelief. Outside, the storm continued its work. The fallen wires tangled in the drifts, twisting like veins through the city's frozen heart. The telegraph offices went dark, one after another, their clocks ticking louder in the absence of sound, and above them all the wind screamed through the lattice of poles and empty lines, making a sound that some swore resembled speech. A whisper in a lost language, saying only what the storm already knew, that the city's last words had been spoken. By the time the telegraphs went dead, the gaslights began to follow. At first, the city flickered in patches, one street dark, another still glowing faintly through the storm. But soon, the pressure in the mains dropped, and the faint yellow glow that had guided New Yorkers for decades winked out across entire districts. The snow reflected what little light remained, turning the streets into corridors of ghostly gray. Then, one by one, even those reflections faded. The city was blind. On Broadway, people wandered through the dark in small clusters, their faces hidden behind scarves, their eyes wide and shining in the lamplight that no longer burned. The lamps themselves stood like grave markers, black posts capped with ice, their glass globes shattered by the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a window pane broke, followed by the slow crash of a signboard collapsing into the snow. After that, only the wind spoke. In the wealthy districts uptown, servants scrambled to light candles and oil lamps, but even that seemed futile. Drafts swept through every crack, extinguishing flames faster than they could be struck. Curtains caught fire from carelessly held matches, then smothered themselves in their own ash. Parlors filled with smoke and panic. The air grew bitter, heavy with soot and fear. At the Fifth Avenue Hotel, the great chandeliers that once blazed with hundreds of jets stood cold and dark, their crystals rimed with frost. Guests huddled in the lobby, wrapped in overcoats and quilts, listening to the walls groan under the strain of the wind. Somewhere above, the ceiling plaster cracked, snow sifting down through the gap. The manager, a thin man with trembling hands, carried a single lantern through the crowd, whispering that everything was under control. But even he didn't believe it. In the tenements of the Lower East Side, the darkness came earlier. The gas had failed by evening, and the residents had nothing to burn but scraps, wooden spoons, broken chairs, rags dipped in oil. The smell of smoke filled the stairwells, mingling with the damp stench of melting snow. Mothers sat on the floors with their children in their laps, rocking them in the dark, counting the seconds between gusts. Somewhere, a baby cried until its voice grew hoarse, then fell silent. The city's heartbeat, the lights that marked its rhythm, was gone. The bridges vanished into blackness, their outlines erased. The harbor lights went out too, one by one, until even the sea disappeared. Sailors said later that it was the strangest night they had ever seen. The horizon gone, the stars hidden, the world reduced to darkness and wind. The sound of the city, a thing once so constant no one noticed it, had been replaced by the noise of destruction. Inside a boarding house on 12th Street, a young woman lit a final candle and set it by her window. She thought perhaps someone might see it and take comfort. But when she looked out, all she saw was her own reflection in the glass, pale, shivering, already fading. The candle guttered once, then went out, leaving only the faint glow of snow against the window pane. For hours afterward, the city existed as a shadow of itself. The streets were full of ghosts, real or imagined figures moving soundlessly through the drifts. People said you could hear the snow breathing, that if you listened long enough, it whispered back the names of those who had perished. By midnight, even the most stubborn lights had died. New York, the city of 1,000 lamps, the city that never slept, was swallowed whole. Only the storm remained awake, prowling through its empty streets, its icy breath turning every window black. The darkness had claimed the city, and it would not release it until dawn. By the third morning, the storm had lost none of its strength. In the narrow streets of the Lower East Side, the snow had climbed past the second-floor windows. Doorways were sealed, staircases buried, and what little daylight filtered through the storm arrived dim and colorless, as though it had died somewhere above the clouds. Inside the tenements, the cold pressed inward through the bricks, creeping under doors and into blankets. The air itself seemed to burn when breathed. The children woke first. They always did. Their small bodies couldn't hold warmth for long, and hunger had no patience for weather. Barefoot, they crept from their beds and pressed their hands to the walls, feeling the frost crawling there. In one building on Hester Street, a boy of 7 tried to open the door and found it frozen shut. He pressed his ear to the wood and heard nothing on the other side, not a sound, not even the wind. It was as if the world beyond the hallway had disappeared. In the apartment above, a woman boiled snow in a dented pot, the only water she could find. The fire in her stove had gone out during the night, and the coals had fused into a single black stone. She placed the pot on top anyway, willing the ice to melt. Her daughter, a girl of 5, sat beside her wrapped in a shawl too big for her frame. She held a tin cup and whispered that she could still hear the sky moving. When her mother asked what she meant, the girl said the sky was whispering to her, that it sounded like someone crying far away. Across the alley, another family had nailed boards over their broken window. The boards rattled like bones in the wind. The father, a dock worker laid off for the winter, had torn apart his only chair for firewood. The smell of burning varnish filled the room, sharp and chemical. His son crouched by the heat, hands outstretched, the skin already split from cold. "Just a little longer," the man said, but even as he spoke, the flame dimmed, shivering like a candle caught in a draught. In every building, it was the same. The wealthy uptown had retreated to their parlors, but down here, survival was measured in hours. Families took turns sleeping so that someone could watch the fire. Babies were wrapped in flour sacks and laid beside boiling kettles to steal what warmth they could. The walls sweated with frost. The smell of cold iron clung to everything, the stoves, the coins, the people themselves. Outside, the snow buried the alleys in perfect silence. A cat, frozen mid-stride, lay curled against a lamppost like a statue carved from ice. The only movement came from the flakes themselves, endlessly falling, endlessly remaking the world into white. When night came again, the light in the tenements faded to nothing. Mothers whispered stories in the dark, fairy tales, old prayers, anything to drown out the sound of the wind clawing at the walls. Some children slept, others didn't. Those who stayed awake said they could feel the building breathe around them, expanding and contracting in the cold. One boy, staring up at the ceiling, asked his sister if she thought the city could die. She told him no, cities were too big for that. But when the plaster cracked above their heads and a fine white dust began to fall, even she stopped believing it. That night, the storm swallowed the last of the tenement lamps. The rooms grew colder than cellars, and the sound of the wind became something else, something like a lullaby, long and low, meant for no living child. In the grand new buildings that had begun to reshape Manhattan's skyline, those proud symbols of progress with their elevators, their iron frames, their endless stairwells, the storm turned triumph into prison. The blizzard's second night had sealed every street and alley, and by the time the third morning crept in gray and colorless, even the tallest buildings stood blind and cut off. Inside them, the modern miracle of the elevator, a device meant to conquer height and time, became a coffin suspended in darkness. At the Western Union building on Day Street, 2 clerks remained in the lift long after it stopped between the 5th and 6th floors. They had tried to descend when the power faltered the previous night, hoping to reach the lower lobby where others had gathered. But as the car shuddered and halted, they found themselves in a pocket of absolute stillness. The gaslight flickered once, then died, leaving only the faint smell of iron and oil. They hammered on the doors until their fists bled, but the sound went nowhere, swallowed by the storm outside and the emptiness within. Above them, in the offices that had once buzzed with telegraphs and typewriters, the windows were veiled in frost so thick it looked like marble. Desks sat buried beneath drifts that had forced their way through broken panes. A single inkwell had frozen mid-spill, the dark stain crawling across the page like a spreading bruise. The entire floor looked like it had been abandoned for years, though only hours had passed. Across the city, the same story repeated. At the Astor Building, a night watchman was found standing motionless in an elevator cage, his lantern extinguished, the rope above him frozen solid. In the Equitable Life Tower, 3 women on their way to the basement were trapped as the counterweight jammed in the shaft. They sang hymns to keep from screaming, their voices echoing upward through the hollow core of the structure, faint and haunting, like a church buried beneath snow. Far uptown, at the New Dakota apartments, residents tried to carry food and water to their servants in the basement. The winding staircases were too narrow for the elderly to climb, and when the elevator ceased working, the housemaids were left stranded below, cut off from light and sound. They burned newspapers in the corridor to keep warm, the flames reflected in their eyes like tiny, desperate suns. In one office on Madison Avenue, a young stenographer sat trapped between the 3rd and 4th floors, clutching her notebook to her chest. She had tried to climb out through the roof hatch, but the metal burned her palms with cold. The shaft around her hummed faintly as the wind found its way through the cracks. For hours she listened to the cables groan and sway, convinced they would snap. To keep her courage, she whispered aloud the last letter she had transcribed before the machines went silent, a message that would never be sent. To my dearest wife, the snow is rising faster than I can believe. If I do not return, know that I thought of you with every breath. Outside, the storm howled through the gaps between buildings, forcing its way into every crevice of the city's new age. The wires that once carried light and power now hung frozen in knots. Steam pipes burst underground, filling basements with ghostly clouds. The snow pressed against every door, every window, every seam of progress, as if testing how much the city could endure before it gave way. By nightfall, the trapped no longer called for help. Their voices had joined the wind's endless murmur, rising up the elevator shafts, and through the cracks in the walls a chorus of those who had built the modern world, and now found themselves suspended between its promises and its ruin. When the storm reached its height, the city sent out its last defenders. At police precincts across Manhattan, men tightened their coats, pulled wool scarves over their faces, and stepped into the white oblivion with lanterns that glowed like dying stars. Their orders were simple: find the stranded, calm the panicked, and guide anyone lost in the drifts to shelter. None of them knew that most would never return. At the Mulberry Street station, Captain Burns stood in the doorway as his patrolmen filed out. Their blue coats were already dusted with snow before they reached the steps. "You'll see the lamps along Broadway," he shouted, though his voice barely carried. "Follow the light. Keep moving." But by the time the last man stepped into the street, the lamps had gone out. The storm devoured sound, shape, and distance. Within moments, the policemen were gone too, figures swallowed whole by the white. The first hours passed in confusion. Reports came in of carriages overturned on 23rd Street, families trapped in boarding houses, bodies frozen in the park. Officers tried to move toward the cries but found themselves walking in circles, the snow higher than their knees. A few managed to drag survivors into shops or stairwells before collapsing themselves, their breath turning to frost on their lips. Near the East River, Officer Nolan was last seen leading a group of dock workers toward a warehouse that still had heat. He carried a small boy in his arms, the child's face wrapped in a scarf. Witnesses said he vanished only a few yards from safety. When the storm cleared 3 days later, they found him standing upright beneath a drift, the boy still held tight against his chest. The child had lived. Nolan had not. In Midtown, 2 officers from the 29th Precinct tried to reach a stalled omnibus near Madison Square. They followed the line of telegraph poles for guidance, their lanterns dimmed to a red glow by the snow. One man slipped, striking his head against the iron base of a lamp. The other knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder, calling his name. But the wind stole the words. When rescuers later uncovered the spot, both men were found sitting side by side, frozen in place, as if still waiting for orders. Throughout the city, the same fate repeated itself, small acts of courage buried beneath the storm. On the Bowery, an officer used his own coat to cover a shivering woman and froze where he stood. Near Washington Square, another broke into a bakery to shelter a family, then went back out to find others. They found him days later, only a few yards away, his whistle still clutched in his gloved hand. By morning, the precincts began to realize the truth. Lanterns lit along the streets never moved again. Patrols failed to report back. In the silence that followed, the surviving officers gathered around their stoves, staring at the empty hooks on the wall, where coats still hung, names stitched in white thread above them. When the storm finally broke, they went out to look for their own. The snowbanks had hardened into walls of glassy ice, and it took hours to cut through. Every few blocks, a glint of brass appeared, a button, a badge, a whistle, mute tokens of the men who had gone to save others and found only the storm. The newspapers would later print their names beneath a single headline, "The Policeman Who Never Came Back." But the survivors said that title was wrong. On nights when the wind rose again over the city, when snow whispered against the windows, they could still hear faint whistles in the distance, answered, then lost echoes of duty that never truly ended. At dawn on the 4th day, when even the river had stopped groaning beneath its ice, a rumor spread through the few telegraph offices still manned by candlelight. A ferry had gone missing between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Some thought it had been crushed by the floes, others that it had drifted downstream into the harbor. But those who lived along the East River knew the truth long before the city did. They had seen it with their own eyes, a black shape locked in the ice, halfway between the two shores, unmoving beneath the weight of snow. The Williamsburg Ferry No. 2 had left its dock late in the evening before the storm's worst hours, carrying 50 passengers and 3 crewmen. The captain, Charles Leland, was a steady man, known for guiding his vessel through fog thick enough to hide the skyline. He had no reason to think this night would be different. The snow was heavy but manageable, the current slow. He rang the bell, the engine chugged to life, and the ferry eased away from the pier into the swirling dark. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nothing. The shoreline disappeared, and the world shrank to the small circle of lantern light on the deck. Passengers huddled together, faces hidden behind scarves, eyes stinging from the wind. A woman asked if they were near the middle yet. No one could answer. The pilot stared into a wall of white and saw only his own reflection faintly glowing in the glass. Then came the first shudder. The hull struck something ice, perhaps, or debris. The ferry slowed, the engines grinding, then stalled. The water around them thickened, dark seams forming where the current froze in motion. The captain ordered the crew to stoke the boilers, but the fire would not catch. The coal was damp, the air too cold. A sheet of ice began to build along the deck, sealing hatches, stiffening ropes, trapping the ship as if the river itself meant to keep it. By midnight, the passengers could hear the sound of the hull cracking. Men used axes and crowbars to try to free the rudder, their breath rising in clouds that turned instantly to frost. The women and children were moved inside the cabin, where the smell of oil lamps and fear grew thick. One man suggested walking across the ice to shore, but when he stepped onto it, the surface gave a deep, hollow moan. He took one more step before the ice fractured beneath him, swallowing him whole. His hat was the last thing anyone saw. The hours passed in slow panic. People burned seat cushions for warmth. One woman tore her petticoats into strips to wrap around her children's hands. The captain moved among them, promising rescue come daylight, though he knew no one could reach them. The snow outside rose until it covered the deck rails, sealing them in a white tomb. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the world frozen in silence. The Williamsburg ferry was still there, a black scar on the glittering surface of the river. From the docks, it looked close enough to touch, yet unreachable. Men with ropes and poles tried to reach it, but the ice shifted and cracked under their weight. Days later, when the thaw began, the vessel finally drifted free, its deck buried in snow. All 53 souls were still aboard, frozen where they sat. Faces turned toward the windows, as if waiting for the city that had forgotten them. For weeks afterward, no one crossed the river. The ferries lay idle, and the bridges unfinished. Half-built skeletons stood useless against the sky. The East River had claimed its own, and New York, humbled, watched from the shore as the ice carried its dead quietly toward the sea. The wind cut through the iron like a knife through bone. By the fourth day, the elevated railway pride of the modern age stood motionless above a city buried in silence. Its tracks, suspended on trembling girders, vanished into veils of snow that blurred the skyline. The carriages that had once thundered down these rails, filled with merchants, factory girls, and bankers rushing uptown, now hung frozen in mid-journey like the ribs of a great dead animal. At the 3rd Avenue line, near 42nd Street, a maintenance crew of 7 men had stayed behind when the blizzard began. They were railmen, hard workers who trusted steel more than sky, and they had orders to keep the line open as long as possible. The first day, they'd managed to clear the tracks, hacking at the drifts with shovels and crowbars. But the storm moved faster than their hands. By the second night, snow was waist-deep even on the platforms, and the rails had vanished beneath a white crust thick as stone. The foreman, a man named O'Rourke, decided they would shelter inside one of the stalled cars until morning. The little iron box groaned with the wind, its windows etched with frost. They lit a lantern and passed around a flask of whiskey, the only warmth they had left. Below them, through the storm's howling, they could hear the city breaking apart, the crash of distant chimneys, the mournful groan of collapsing roofs. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, like the breath of a creature too large to see. At dawn, the storm showed no mercy. Snow fell sideways, filling every open space. The elevated tracks began to shift under the weight, the metal flexing with a sound that turned their stomachs. When O'Rourke stepped outside, his boots sank into ice that clung to the railings like skin. He shouted for the men to stay low, but his voice was carried off instantly. From their perch, they could see nothing but white, a blank horizon stretching forever. Around midday, the line shuddered violently. Somewhere up the track, a supporting beam had cracked under the weight. The men felt the tremor pass beneath them like a heartbeat. A mile south, near 23rd Street, a section of track gave way entirely, collapsing onto the street below in a shower of sparks and iron. Those who saw it from their windows swore it looked like lightning striking the earth. The crew held their ground, knowing any attempt to descend would mean death. Instead, they moved from car to car, checking the bolts, chipping ice from the joints, whispering prayers they didn't know they remembered. By evening, their lantern had died, and the cold crept in for good. One by one, they stopped moving, their bodies curling into themselves for warmth. When rescuers finally reached the elevated line 4 days later, they found them seated where they had fallen asleep, hands still blackened with grease, faces calm, as if merely waiting for the next train. From the street below, the frozen cars looked like lanterns hung in the sky. The people of New York stared upward, realizing that even the iron bones of their city, the marvels of progress and industry, had not survived the storm. The elevated, that symbol of human triumph over gravity, had become a monument instead, a bridge between the living and the dead, suspended in the quiet above the snow. In the heart of Manhattan, where luxury once promised refuge from every hardship, even the grandest of rooms could not keep out the storm. The Fifth Avenue Hotel, New York's proud palace of marble and brass, had survived fire, riots, and presidents. But by the 5th day of the blizzard, it stood frozen to its bones. The steam pipes had cracked sometime before dawn, and when the guests awoke, they could see their breath floating pale in the air like ghosts risen from the carpet. The morning began with disbelief. Gentlemen in dressing gowns rang for their attendants, certain that a quick word with management would restore the heat. But the bells rang unanswered. The hallways were empty except for the soft hiss of escaping steam and the faint sound of plaster cracking above the chandeliers. By mid-morning, rumors spread faster than warmth pipes burst in the basement, the boilers dead, the staff gone to help the stranded in the streets. The truth was simpler and crueler. There was no fuel left to burn. Downstairs, the grand lobby that had once glittered beneath crystal light now lay draped in shadow. Candles burned low on the marble counters, their wax frozen before it could melt. The great clock above the reception desk had stopped at 4:17, the minute the last of the city's gas pressure gave out. Guests gathered in clusters around the remaining hearths, their fur coats and blankets piled high like fortresses. Conversation dwindled into whispers. Among them sat a widow from Boston, her eyes fixed on the frosted windowpanes. Each breath she exhaled formed small, perfect circles of mist that vanished instantly. She was on her way to visit her son at the university, stranded now in a hotel room worth more than most men's lives, yet powerless to summon warmth. When a bellboy offered her a glass of brandy, she smiled faintly and asked if the snow could break glass. "It already has, ma'am," he said. Every window on the north side's cracked clean through. Upstairs, the corridors had become rivers of ice. The once plush carpets were stiff beneath the guests' shoes, and doors had to be forced open with shoulders. Water from the burst pipes had run down the stairwells overnight, freezing in ribbons that glimmered under the candlelight. In the dining room, silverware fused to the tables, and the velvet drapes hung heavy with frost. Still, the guests came drawn by habit, hunger, or the illusion of routine. They sat in their furs and ordered food that would never arrive, their voices echoing in the hollow grandeur of the place. When night fell, the staff gathered the guests in the ballroom, the only space large enough to hold them all. Lanterns glowed along the walls, their light flickering across the mirrors, multiplying the faces of the frightened and the weary. Someone tried to play the piano, but the keys stuck fast, their ivory split by the cold. Instead, they listened to the creak of the beams, the distant moan of wind forcing its way through the keyholes, the steady crackle of ice tightening around the walls. Outside, Fifth Avenue was a graveyard of carriages and snowdrifts. The lampposts stood dark, the shops buried to their awnings. Inside the hotel, the wealthy huddled in silence, stripped of every illusion of safety their money had ever bought. For the first time in memory, all of New York, poor and rich, powerful and forgotten, shivered under the same merciless storm. By dawn, frost traced the ceilings like veins of glass. The Fifth Avenue Hotel, once called the Palace of the People, had gone still. It stood gleaming and dead, a monument of marble entombed in ice. Those who survived said they would never forget the sight of it. At sunrise, the grandest building in the city turned pale as a tomb, its windows glinting faintly like the eyes of something that had just learned fear. By the sixth morning, the blizzard had stripped New York of its language. No whistles, no bells, no carriages, no human cry could travel more than a few feet before the wind devoured it. The city had gone mute, and yet, somehow, people still tried to speak scratching words into the snow on windows, steps, and walls, leaving messages that the storm itself would soon erase. It began downtown, where the isolation was most complete. Families trapped inside tenements scrawled names and pleas for help on the glass with the last warmth of their fingertips. "Alive," one window read. "Send bread." On another, a child had written backward in frost, so the words could be read from the street. "We are here." Passers-by who caught sight of such messages could only nod in acknowledgement, their faces half hidden in scarves, before trudging on toward their own dark homes. In boarding houses near the East River, sailors stranded on shore left messages for ships that would never sail. They pressed their palms against frozen panes and traced the names of their vessels, Aurora, Essex, Nantucket, as if writing them might bring them safely home. On one warehouse wall, someone had used coal dust to scrawl a single word in crooked letters. Wait. No one knew who had written it or who it was meant for. It stayed there until the thaw, when the melting snow carried it away like a secret finally told. In the heart of the city, where the snow piled higher than door frames, people carved tunnels through the drifts to reach the streets. They used the sides of these snow walls as message boards, writing notes with sticks and soot, names, arrows, and directions to shelters that might no longer exist. Warmth 2 blocks south. Children upstairs. Bread here, ring twice. Each message was a fragment of hope, frozen, buried, then lost as the next gust wiped the words away. A young telegraph apprentice on Wall Street, desperate to reach his mother in Brooklyn, began writing messages in the snow at the edge of the bridge, where the cables had snapped. Each morning, he cleared a patch and wrote her name, then beneath it, "Still alive." On the third morning, when he returned, the space was covered with a new message written in smaller, trembling letters. "Me too." For a moment he thought it a miracle. Then he noticed a faint trail of footprints leading back toward the river. The wind took both messages soon after, erasing them together. Not all the messages were hopeful. On the facades of warehouses and shops, people scrawled warnings. "No more food," "Ice above floor," "Don't dig here." In Midtown, a baker trapped with his family used a bit of chalk to write on the frosted window, "We'll keep the oven burning till it's gone." When rescuers found him days later, the oven was still lit, the words faintly visible beneath the ice. By the time the storm began to weaken, the city's walls had become its diary. The snow recorded everything: the scratches of shovels, the trails of hands pressed into the drifts, the fleeting messages between strangers who would never meet. And though the wind erased most of them, a few survived in memory. A window pane in a forgotten flat, still etched with a single word that no one could bring themselves to clean away: home. It was written in the delicate curve of a child's hand, traced on the inside of the glass where no storm could reach. When the snow finally melted and the light returned to New York, that one word still shimmered faintly in the morning sun, proof that even in a city buried alive, someone had kept trying to be found. By the seventh night, The last trains had stopped running. The lines north of the city, once pulsing with light and motion, now lay beneath a shroud of white. Engines that had roared and smoked only hours earlier stood silent on the tracks, their wheels fused to the rails by ice. The most famous of them all, the New Haven Express bound for Boston, had frozen in place at Harlem Bridge, trapped mid-crossing, its carriages rising out of the snow like tombstones. It had left Grand Central before the worst of the storm, filled with passengers desperate to escape the city before the lines closed. Among them were businessmen with leather satchels, a mother with 2 small children, a priest, and a young couple returning to Connecticut to be married. The conductor, a proud man named McAvoy, had sworn he'd get them through. He had done so before, in storms almost as fierce, but not like this, not one that seemed to erase the very air around them. By the time the train reached Harlem, visibility was gone. The river below had frozen into plates of grey ice, creaking under the weight of snow. McAvoy ordered the engineer to stop and wait for the signal from the next station. But the signal never came. The telegraph lines were down, the lamps buried. He pulled the brake anyway, just in time to see the snow engulf the tracks ahead. The train shuddered once, then came to a permanent halt. For a while, the passengers thought it was temporary. They spoke in calm voices, offered tea, laughed too loudly. The heat from the furnace kept them warm, but when the fuel began to dwindle, McAvoy realized they were trapped. He sent 2 brakemen ahead to scout the line. They tied scarves around their faces, climbed out into the storm, and were gone within minutes. No one ever saw them again. Inside, the temperature dropped quickly. Frost bloomed across the windows, sealing them like crystal. The mother wrapped her children in blankets, whispering lullabies while their breath rose in tiny clouds. The young couple sat hand in hand, the bride-to-be's veil stiff with ice. The priest moved between the cars, murmuring prayers under his breath. McAvoy walked the aisles, lighting every remaining lantern, his breath thick and ragged in the cold. He told the passengers to stay calm, that someone would come when the storm broke. But even he knew there was no one left to come. Hours passed. The fire went out. The iron stove glowed once, then dimmed. People fell silent, their bodies curling into themselves for warmth. One man tried to break a window to climb out, but the glass refused. It was frozen solid from both sides. The sound of the wind through the cracks of the carriage grew into a steady moan, like the train itself was grieving. When rescuers reached Harlem Bridge days later, they found the express buried to its roofline. The snow had hardened into a smooth, gleaming crust that hid everything beneath it. It took 12 men with shovels and pickaxes to pry open the doors. Inside, the passengers were still in their seats, hands clasped, heads bowed, faces pale and peaceful. The priest's Bible lay open in his lap, its pages frozen together. The train never moved again. For years afterward, the locals called it the dead train, and on certain nights, when the wind rushed through the girders of the bridge, they swore they could hear it again, the long, low whistle drifting through the dark, carrying the names of those who never made it home. On the 8th morning, the city began to cave in on itself. The weight of 4 days of snow, wet, heavy, relentless, pressed down on every building like a slow, invisible hand. Rafters creaked, chimneys buckled, and the skyline groaned as if under siege. The wind had calmed by then, but the silence it left behind was more terrible than the storm's roar. It was a silence that listened. The first collapse came just before dawn. A bakery on Broome Street gave way without warning. Neighbors awoke to a dull, echoing crack followed by a long sigh, like a body releasing its final breath. When they opened their doors, the building was gone, its roof folded into itself, its walls flattened into the snow. The smell of flour and charred wood drifted through the air. No one knew how many had been inside. By mid-morning, the reports multiplied. A stable on West 14th Street, a boarding house near Canal, the grand glass roof of the old train depot shattered, its panels falling like guillotine blades. The snow had turned to ice overnight, hard as stone, and each flake that fell afterward only added another ounce to the burden. In the Bowery, tenants could hear the timbers above them groaning. They gathered their belongings and fled into the streets, only to find that the streets themselves were gone tunnels of white, leading nowhere. One woman carried her child out into the storm barefoot, convinced she'd be safer under the open sky. By the time she reached the corner, a sound like thunder split the air. The building she'd fled had collapsed entirely, sending a plume of powder skyward that settled around her like smoke. She never looked back. Even the mansions of Fifth Avenue weren't spared. One by one, the flat roofs cracked under the weight. Servants scrambled to clear snow from balconies, but it was too late. The drifts refroze faster than they could shovel. A ballroom roof at Madison and 34th gave way during breakfast, crushing the long oak table beneath a glacier of debris. By noon, the hotel kitchens along Broadway were shuttered, their chimneys fallen, their ovens buried in rubble. Rescue parties tried to move through the streets, but progress was slow. Every footstep was a gamble. The snow had hardened into layers, ice over powder, powder over splintered wood. Men listened for warning sounds, the low whine of a beam under strain, the faint ticking of shifting nails. When they heard it, they stopped, held their breath, and waited. Sometimes the sound passed, sometimes it didn't. At City Hall, the roof began to sag, its stone arches bowing inward. Workers tied ropes across the upper beams, hoping to hold the structure together until the thaw. A reporter watching from the square wrote that the building looked like a cathedral turned into a tomb. By dusk, the sky had cleared to a pale blue, cruel in its calm. The storm had ended, but the city's undoing had just begun. From the harbor to Harlem, the roofs continued to fall slowly, methodically, one after another, as though the storm had left behind invisible hands to finish its work. When night came, the survivors gathered in the streets, staring up at what remained of their homes. No one spoke. The sound of breaking wood carried far in the cold air, echoing between the ruined walls. It was said that, for weeks afterward, people flinched at the sound of a door slamming or a cart tipping, mistaking it for that familiar noise, the sound of another roof surrendering under the weight of a merciless sky. By the 9th day, hunger and cold had become the city's twin rulers. The storm had buried food cellars, frozen wells, and blocked every road that once carried deliveries from the countryside. Bakeries stood silent, their ovens lifeless beneath collapsed chimneys. Coal wagons lay overturned in the streets, their black cargo sealed beneath drifts of white. For the first time in living memory, New York, so proud, so loud, so certain of its invincibility, was starving. The first to feel it were the poor. In the Lower East Side, families had already burned through every scrap of wood in their homes. Chairs, floorboards, even stair rails were ripped apart to feed small fires that smoked but gave no heat. The air in the tenements smelled of ash and desperation. When the snow finally stopped, men wrapped rags around their feet and ventured into the streets in search of fuel. Walking past the bodies of horses stiff as statues, their hides glistening with frost. From their bellies, steam still rose faintly, a grotesque reminder of the warmth that once was. Bread was worth more than gold. A single loaf fetched a day's wage, if one could find it at all. In the few bakeries that remained standing, long lines of people formed, faces hidden behind scarves, waiting in silence. When the doors opened, fights broke out almost immediately, men and women clawing for the last rolls on the counter, shouting until their voices cracked. One baker on Bleecker Street refused to raise his prices. By nightfall, his shop had been broken into. Every crumb gone, his body found slumped beside the oven he'd tried to relight. Coal merchants, too, faced their reckoning. With deliveries halted, their stores became fortresses. Guards were posted at the doors, rifles in hand. Families arrived with whatever they could carry, silver candlesticks, watches, even wedding rings to barter for a bucket of black fuel. Some were turned away, their treasures useless against scarcity. One man offered his violin to a coal yard foreman. The foreman took it, gave him half a sack, and then left the instrument propped against the gate, where the wind played its frozen strings until morning. In the grand houses uptown, hunger came later but struck just as hard. Servants, trapped inside with their employers, rationed the food behind locked pantry doors. The wealthy dined on what remained of their preserves, canned fruits, salted meats, but soon even that ran out. The scent of cooking vanished from Fifth Avenue, replaced by the bitter tang of burnt velvet as curtains were sacrificed to the fire. Beneath their gilded ceilings, the city's elite sat wrapped in furs, gnawing on stale crusts and listening to the same wind that battered the poor below. By the river, the worst of humanity emerged. Men broke into coal depots under cover of darkness, hauling whatever they could carry in sacks and wheelbarrows. There were fights, bloody, wordless struggles in the snow. A constable who tried to stop them was found the next morning lying face down in the drifts, his badge half buried, his lantern still burning beside him. And yet, amid the ruin, moments of mercy still flickered. A grocer on Mulberry Street gave away his last barrels of flour to the neighbors who had helped him dig out his shop. A church on the Bowery opened its doors, its pews turned into makeshift beds, its altar covered in loaves baked from whatever could be scraped together. For one night, the smell of bread, real bread, rose above the city again, sweet and fleeting. When the wind picked up once more, scattering cinders and snow alike, people said it smelled faintly of hope. But in the cold days that followed, hope froze like everything else, cracked, brittle, and silent, waiting for spring. By the 10th day, the storm had ended, yet New York remained a city under arrest. The air was still, the sky a merciless blue, but the snow had hardened into walls smooth, white, and unyielding. It no longer fell, it encased. Every street had become a corridor of ice, every doorway a cell. The living moved quietly through narrow tunnels they carved with shovels and bare hands, prisoners in their own city. No sound carried far in this new world. The snow absorbed everything, the clatter of tools, the creak of wagons, even the sobs of the hungry. It was said you could stand in the middle of Broadway and hear your own heartbeat. The wind had taken its voice with it when it left. Only the crunch of boots and the occasional fall of a roof broke the silence. Men began to call it the Great White Prison. The name spread quickly, whispered by those who understood that the city had not survived the storm, it had merely been entombed by it. Telegraph poles poked out of the drifts like crosses in a cemetery. The grand facades of buildings peaked above the snow line, their first floors buried, their windows sealed shut by ice. Children, too small to remember the city's former noise, played on rooftops as though they were new streets, unaware that beneath their feet lay entire neighborhoods. At City Hall, the government was paralyzed. Officials huddled in fur coats around candle stubs, drafting proclamations that no one could read because there was no way to distribute them. The mayor declared an emergency, though the word meant little now. There were no telegraphs, no trains, no carriages, nothing that moved faster than a man's stride. Even horses, the city's lifeblood, were nearly gone. The few still standing were half-starved and blind from the glare of the snow, their hooves splitting on the frozen cobbles. Some people tried to dig their way free. Along Mulberry and Canal, men with picks and shovels hacked at the snow to reopen the streets, working until their hands bled. But for every inch they gained, the cold reclaimed too. Beneath the surface, the snow was no longer soft, it was ice fused with soot and broken glass, dense as stone. Shovels rang against it like metal striking iron. The laborers called it the city's second skin. Inside their buried homes, the survivors adapted. Windows became doors, doors became walls. People climbed out through attic hatches, stepping onto what used to be the rooftops of their neighbors. They built paths from chimney to chimney, bridges of packed snow connecting one family to the next. The city's skyline had shifted. It now belonged to those who could climb. At night, the tunnels glowed faintly with lantern light. You could look down from an upper floor and see the city breathing small orange halos moving slowly through the white labyrinth below. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching a candle burn in a crypt. But the beauty was deceiving. Food was gone, coal was gone, and soon the air itself began to thin. Fires refused to burn properly. Smothered by lack of draft, people grew dizzy, their breaths shallow and cold. The city was not merely trapped, it was suffocating. And yet, amid the silence and the frost, life persisted. On the 10th night, someone played a violin on a rooftop near Gramercy Park. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a single, trembling melody rising into the frozen air. Those who heard it said the tune was neither sad nor hopeful, only stubborn. It lasted less than a minute before the bow snapped in the cold, but that minute was enough, because in the great white prison, even one note of music was proof that the city still had a pulse. By the 11th day, the mail wagons were still buried to their axles, the horses long since dead or released to wander the drifts. The post offices, once so full of motion, the stamping of letters, the ring of clerks calling routes and names had fallen silent. The storm had frozen communication as surely as it had frozen the rivers. No word came in, and none went out. Yet inside those darkened buildings, thousands of letters still waited, sealed and unsent, their ink smudged, their paper curling in the damp. The General Post Office on Nassau Street was one of the last buildings still standing unbroken. Its iron pillars and thick walls had held against the wind, but inside it was no warmer than the streets. Clerks in overcoats worked by lamplight, their breath fogging the air. They sorted and bundled by habit, though no wagons would come to take their loads. They tied twine around stacks of envelopes, destined for cities they could no longer reach. Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and stacked them neatly in frozen piles like gravestones. One clerk, a quiet man named Adams, had spent 20 years behind the same counter. He knew the shape and weight of a love letter just by touch. On the morning of the 12th, he found one addressed in a delicate hand to a house on Pearl Street, only a few blocks away. The street was impassable, the drifts nearly to the second floor, but something in the handwriting stirred him. He slipped the envelope into his coat and stepped out into the cold. Outside, the city was deathly still. Snowbanks rose higher than his shoulders, glinting like glass in the morning sun. The wind had stopped, leaving the air sharp and cruel. Adams moved through narrow tunnels of white, his breath coming in gasps. He passed half-buried wagons, the heads of lampposts jutting from the snow like gravestones. When he reached Pearl Street, the buildings were shuttered, their doors sealed under ice. He searched each one until he found the number he sought, scratched half away on a doorframe. He knocked once, then again, though no sound seemed to carry. A woman finally opened from the upper floor, her face pale in the weak light. She stared down in disbelief as he held up the envelope. "Mail," he said hoarsely, "from uptown." She descended through the snow like a figure in a dream, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered something he couldn't hear. Adams nodded once, turned, and vanished back into the drifts. Elsewhere in the city, others tried the same. Boys trudged through the tunnels, delivering what mail they could, messages of love, of worry, of hope, written before the storm turned deadly. Most never reached their destination. Letters were found weeks later, fused into the ice, their ink blurred into black stains. Some were lost altogether, carried off by the wind, snowed over, and forgotten. When the thaw finally came, the postman dug through what remained of the frozen sacks. They spread the letters across long tables to dry, the paper wrinkled and translucent from moisture. Many bore no names anymore, only fragments of sentences. "Tell mother, we are safe. Don't worry, I will come soon." Words that trailed off into nothing. A poet who saw them later wrote that the city had written its own epitaph in those half-frozen pages. The letters were never delivered, but their silence said everything, that love had persisted, even when no one was left to read it. And when the last bundle was burned for warmth that winter, the smoke rose slowly through the air, curling between the rooftops, carrying with it all the words that never arrived. By the 12th day, the snow had begun to glitter with strange beauty again. The wind had quieted, the sun returned, and from a distance the city looked peaceful, its rooftops smooth, its spires gleaming like marble against a sky scrubbed clean of storm. But beauty has its cruelties. Beneath that glittering skin, New York was a necropolis. The streets, the cellars, the drifts, all held bodies. The storm had claimed so many that no one knew where to begin counting. In the poorer wards, death arrived silently, almost politely. A cough that became a whisper, a sleep that never ended. Families wrapped their dead in sheets and placed them near the windows, hoping the cold would keep them preserved until help came. But no one came. The undertakers had run out of horses, their carts buried deep beneath the snow. Coffins were useless when the ground was frozen solid. The bodies waited, stiff and pale, as if listening for footsteps that would not come. On Hester Street, a neighbor broke into a tenement when he realized he hadn't heard the children next door for 2 days. Inside he found the family seated as if for supper, the mother slumped over a pot of melted snow, the father still in his chair, a Bible frozen open before him. The children sat together on the bed, their faces serene, their hands clasped. He covered them again and shut the door quietly, marking it with a charcoal cross. The hospitals were no better. At Bellevue, the furnaces had gone out and the wards filled with frost. Nurses moved from bed to bed, their hands numb beneath their gloves. Some patients froze before dawn, others died of hunger waiting for supplies that never arrived. The morgue overflowed by the 3rd day of calm. The attendants, unable to dig graves, began stacking the bodies against the outer walls where the snow was firmest. From the street, they looked like another drift, an anonymous heap of white. Downtown, the police wagons that could still move were repurposed as makeshift hearses. Men loaded the dead 2 at a time and carried them to the wharves, where the wind was sharpest. The plan was to wait for thaw before burial, but by then the count was impossible. No one knew who was missing and who had simply fled the city. Clerks stopped keeping records. The numbers in the ledgers ended abruptly after the first week. The churches tolled their bells only once a day now. The sound carried strangely across the frozen city, thin, mournful, and far away. The priests performed last rites in batches, reading prayers over rows of nameless faces. God knows each one, a pastor said to a woman weeping for her husband. Even if we don't. She nodded, but did not look up. Her tears froze to her scarf before they could fall. When the thaw finally began, the truth surfaced in the gutters and along the riverbanks. The ice melted slowly, releasing what it had taken. Hands reached out from the drifts, the skin pale as candle wax. Faces emerged from the snow, eyes open as if watching spring return without them. No official number was ever agreed upon. Some said 200, others whispered 2,000. But those who had lived through it refused to count at all. They said it was better not to know that the storm had taken what it wanted, and that to measure it would be to invite it back. So they turned away from the bodies when the thaw came, and they let the rivers carry the rest. And in that way, the city began to heal not through mercy, but through forgetting. By the 13th day, even the bells had frozen. The clappers were locked in place, sealed by ice, thick as stone. In every church, from the Battery to Harlem, towers that once rang across the city's valleys of brick stood silent against the blue morning sky. The snow had reached the lower arches, and the doors were sealed halfway up their frames, so the faithful entered through side windows and cellars, crawling on hands and knees into their sanctuaries. Inside St. Patrick's, the air was cold enough to see one's breath. The great marble pillars gleamed white as bone, and the candles that lined the altar guttered and hissed in the draughts that slipped through the cracks in the stained glass. The priest, Father Malloy, moved through the nave with a lantern, his robe hem stiff with frost. He had not slept in 2 days. Parishioners came and went in silence, kneeling beside the pews or huddling together near the faint warmth of the votive flames. There was no choir, no organ, no echo, only the brittle rustle of fabric and the occasional whisper of prayer. They prayed for warmth. They prayed for their missing. They prayed for the storm to have been the end of it. Every church had become a shelter. In the Bowery Mission, Bodies lay shoulder to shoulder along the pews, each covered in a blanket or a sheet. Volunteers broke apart the confessionals for kindling and fed the scraps into a single iron stove that smoked but refused to catch. The smell of burning lacquer filled the air. A woman with a newborn sat near the altar, rocking her child to a rhythm that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with survival. The clergy worked in silence. They had long since run out of food, and the holy wine had frozen solid in the chalices. Still, they lit what candles they could find, scraping wax from the floor to stretch the hours of light. A nun at Trinity Church whispered to a boy who asked if the angels could hear them now. She told him, yes, but even angels must wait for the thaw. Outside, the graveyards were indistinguishable from the streets, flat white expanses pierced by crosses and half-buried headstones. The drifts had covered everything, the pathways, the fences, even the statues of saints that guarded the gates. The faithful climbed over them to bury their dead in the snow when the ground refused the shovel. Father Malloy stood in the churchyard one afternoon, reading the last rites to a woman whose body had been carried there on a door. The words froze as they left his mouth, the syllables turning brittle in the air. By dusk, the wind rose again. It moved through the steeples, sighing through the gaps in the bells, producing a hollow sound, part moan, part song. The people inside stopped and listened. For a moment, they thought it was a miracle, that the bells were ringing again, but the priest knew better. It was only the storm's breath passing through what remained of the city's faith. That night, the frozen bells gleamed silver in the moonlight. Their silence was not just absence, it was reverence. For the dead, for the living, for the city that had forgotten how to pray and learned again by necessity. When spring came and the ropes were pulled to test them, many bells cracked from within, their metal weakened by the cold. Yet Father Malloy said he preferred them that way. They sound truer now, he told a parishioner, because they remember. On the 14th day, when the thaw still refused to come and the city's heart beat slower with every hour, the legend of the frozen widow began to spread. No one knew her name. Some said she lived on the corner of Broome and Lafayette. Others swore it was Mulberry Street, near the old brewery. What everyone agreed upon was this: she had died standing up, one hand on the doorknob, waiting for a husband who would never return. Her story began, as many tragedies did that winter, in silence. Neighbors had heard nothing from her rooms since the 7th day of the storm. At first, no one thought to check. People were too busy tending their own fires, breaking their own furniture, nursing their own sick. But when the wind died at last, and the men began to dig out the streets, someone remembered the widow, the quiet woman with the black shawl who always lit her lamp at the same hour each evening. No light had been seen there for days. When they reached her door, they found it frozen shut. The lock had seized with ice, and the snow pressed high against the threshold. The men took turns hammering at the wood until it splintered. When they stepped inside, the air that greeted them was so cold it burned. The curtains were stiff with frost. The walls glittered faintly. Every nail head rhymed with ice. In the center of the small room stood the widow. She was dressed for company, a wool dress, her shawl neatly pinned. One gloved hand rested on the doorknob as if she'd tried to leave and changed her mind. Her eyes were open, her lips slightly parted, her hair still arranged beneath her bonnet. The fire in her stove had gone out long ago, the ashes frozen into a solid block. On the table beside her was a single candle, unlit, and a small note that read only, "He will come home if the door is open." The men stood motionless for a long time. The silence pressed on their ears until one of them whispered a prayer. They tried to move her, but her shoes were fused to the floorboards. They had to chip her free with the edge of a shovel, working carefully so her body would not break. When they carried her into the street, the crowd that had gathered fell silent. The snow reflected her pale face until she seemed made of the same substance that had killed her, white, cold, and unyielding. That night, the story spread through the tunnels of the buried city. Some said she had waited for her husband, a sailor trapped somewhere in the frozen harbor. Others claimed he had already died before the storm, and she simply refused to believe it. A few swore they had seen her still, standing at her door even after the thaw, her hand forever poised on the handle, listening for footsteps that never came. When the thaw finally did arrive, the snow melted from the streets faster than anyone expected. But where the widow's house had stood, the drift lingered for weeks longer, refusing to give up its shape. Children passing by said it looked like a woman's figure, stooped, shawl drawn close, watching the world move on without her. And so she became part of the storm's mythology, the embodiment of its quiet cruelty. The newspapers called her the frozen widow of Broome Street, but among those who had seen her, she was simply the one who waited, because in the blizzard of 1888, death came to many uninvited, but she alone had opened the door. By the 15th morning, when the skies cleared to an impossible blue and the drifts glittered like fields of crushed glass, the city finally heard what had happened in the little school on Delancey Street. The newspapers would later call it the miracle of the children, though what occurred was as much sorrow as salvation. The storm had struck on a Monday. Miss Clara Townsend, the schoolmistress, was young and earnest, with fingers stained by chalk and ink, and cheeks that flushed when she read from her books. She had 28 pupils that morning, sons and daughters of dock workers, seamstresses, and porters. When the snow began to fall thick against the windows, she dismissed the older ones to help their parents close shops and collect coal. The younger children she kept inside, promising their families she would walk them home when the wind eased. It never did. By afternoon, the windows were white. The lamps flickered and died. Snow forced its way through the cracks, filling the corners like smoke. Miss Townsend moved the desks together and set the children around the stove, feeding it with scraps of old lesson boards and chair legs. They sang songs to keep their spirits up. My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, Auld Lang Syne, their little voices trembling in time with the walls. As night came, the sounds outside changed. The storm no longer howled, it moaned, deep and endless, pressing on the doors like an intruder. The children cried for their parents, and Miss Townsend told them stories instead, tales of ships that sailed through clouds, of kings who ruled from towers of snow. She smiled, though her lips were blue, though her hands shook as she wrote the names of each child on a scrap of paper and tucked it in her pocket. Just in case. When the fuel ran out, she gathered them close. One of the boys, Daniel, offered his wooden toy horse to burn. She refused at first, then changed her mind. A brave horse, she said softly, as the small figure disappeared in the flames. The light from that last fire cast long shadows on the walls, tiny silhouettes of children huddled together, looking like figures carved from ice. By morning, the storm had buried the building to its roofline. The rescuers found them 3 days later. They had broken a hole through the attic to reach air, their fingers bloodied from scratching through the ceiling plaster. Miss Townsend sat at the center of the circle, her arms still wrapped around the smallest ones. Her body shielded them from the worst of the cold. A few had survived, Daniel among them, the boy who'd given up his toy horse. He was found clutching Miss Townsend's scarf. When they asked him later what happened that night, he said she had sung until the fire died, and then the wind had sounded like her voice, carrying the song away. The city held a service for her when the thaw came. The mayor called her a hero, and the newspapers printed engravings of the little schoolhouse beneath its dome of snow. But those who passed by in later years said the place never quite warmed again. Children who studied there afterward swore they sometimes heard faint singing, when the wind returned in winter, a tune half lullaby, half prayer. And each March, when the city fell quiet and the air turned cold again, the people of Delancey Street lit candles in their windows, one for each child who never came home, and one for the teacher who would not leave them behind. By the 16th dawn, when the worst of the storm had passed inland and sunlight returned like a stranger, the harbor lay still as glass. The East River and Hudson both wore armor, thick plates of ice that stretched from shore to shore, cracked only by the dark ribs of ships frozen in place. Dozens of vessels sat stranded in the white expanse, Ferries, merchant brigs, fishing boats, and coal barges all caught mid-motion when the blizzard sealed the water beneath them. They looked like toys scattered by a careless hand. From the Battery to Governor's Island, the harbor had become a graveyard of masts. Those who ventured to the shoreline spoke of the silence first. In a city that once thrummed with horns, whistles, and the clang of rigging, the stillness felt unnatural. The only sounds were the distant groan of ice shifting and the occasional crack that echoed like gunfire as another hull gave way. No gulls cried, no water lapped against the docks. Even the smell of salt had faded, replaced by the scent of cold iron and coal dust. The sea was gone, replaced by a vast, unmoving mirror that reflected the grey of the sky. Among the ships trapped there were crews who had tried to outlast the storm. On the Mary Bell, a small coastal steamer bound for Boston, the captain and 6 men still lived. They had broken up the furniture for fuel and burned charts and ledgers for kindling. The smoke from their fire hung low in the cabin, mixing with the mist that seeped through every crack. When rescuers finally reached them across the ice, they found the men sitting upright in a circle, their faces blackened by soot, their eyes glassy from cold and hunger. The captain's hand still rested on the ship's log, open to a single unfinished line. "The harbor is full of ghosts." He wasn't wrong. All along the docks, the masts of the frozen vessels creaked and swayed in the wind, producing sounds that resembled voices, low, mournful, rising and falling with the shifting ice. Dockhands called them the harbor dead. At night, the lanterns aboard the stranded ships flickered faintly, giving the illusion that the crews still walked the decks. Men on shore swore they saw figures moving between the masts, waving signals toward Manhattan, though no one ever answered. On the 4th night after the storm, a faint mist rolled in from the sea. It slipped around the ships, curling through the rigging and down the gangways. From the docks, the frozen fleet seemed to breathe. A watchman at the Fulton Fish Market said he saw a schooner raise its flag, though no one stood at the mast. Another claimed the bell of a ferry began to toll by itself. The sound carried across the water a single hollow note that faded into the fog. When the thaw finally came, it came violently. The ice broke apart all at once, splitting with thunder that rolled across the harbor. The ships lurched free in jagged fragments, colliding and grinding against one another as the tide reclaimed them. Many sank before they ever reached shore. Their masts protruded from the water like the bones of whales, marking the places where they had waited too long. In the weeks that followed, the harbor smelled of salt and death. The fishermen called it the sea's revenge. But when night fell and the wind rose, the water still carried strange sounds, the groaning of wood, the clink of chains, the faint rhythm of sails flapping where no sails remained. Those who lived near the docks said the storm had changed the sea forever. They said that, even years later, when winter returned and ice began to form again, the harbor whispered like it remembered. Some nights, if the fog was thick enough, lights appeared out on the water lanterns bobbing between the waves, where no ships sailed, ghosts of the fleet that had once filled the harbor, forever trying to find their way home. By the 17th day, when the city was more grave than living thing, the rescuers came. They were not soldiers or firemen or men of rank, just dock workers, carpenters, grave diggers, and day laborers who refused to stay buried while others still breathed beneath the snow. Their shovels, scavenged from stables and workshops, glinted dull in the pale morning light. They wrapped their hands in rags and soaked their scarves in lamp oil to block the cold from their faces. When they set out, the air was sharp as broken glass and as quiet as a prayer. They began in the tenements, where the narrow alleys had swallowed whole families. The snow there was dense and heavy, compacted by wind until it was harder than stone. Each strike of a shovel made a sound like hammering metal. Beneath their feet lay rooms and stairwells, beds and tables, and somewhere among them, the faint hope of movement. They dug in shifts, calling names into the dark, sometimes answered by silence, sometimes by the muffled cry of a survivor too weak to speak again. One crew on Allen Street broke through the roof of a collapsed boarding house. Inside they found a mother and 2 children alive, pressed against the underside of a table that had held firm. The rescuers lifted them out one by one, their faces pale as the snow itself. When the mother tried to thank them, her lips cracked and bled. The men gave her their last loaf of bread and moved on without names exchanged. Farther uptown, near Madison Square, another team worked through what had once been a row of shops. The air there was thick with the smell of wet plaster and soot. Every few feet they stopped to listen. From under the rubble of a tailor's shop came the faint sound of tapping, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. The men tore through the drift with their hands until their nails split. When at last they reached the source, they found an old man wedged beneath a fallen beam, one arm pinned, his other hand still clutching a pair of tailor's shears. He blinked at the light as if waking from a long dream. "Thought you were angels," he whispered. By dusk, the rescuers had pulled 20 souls from the wreckage and uncovered twice as many bodies. They did not stop. The dead were left covered with sheets of torn canvas so the living might still be found. At night, they worked by lantern light, their shadows jerking against the snow walls like figures in a fever. When the oil ran out, they burned bits of wood and even scraps of old clothing to keep their fires alive. The cold punished them for their mercy. Frostbite blackened their fingers. Their eyes streamed blood from the glare of the ice. One man, too numb to notice, dug until his hands froze around the handle of his shovel. The others pried his fingers loose and wrapped them in cloth. He insisted on going back to work. They called themselves diggers, though some began to joke grimly that they were grave diggers in disguise. Yet each life pulled from the ruins renewed their purpose. When the bodies of the children from Delancey Street were recovered, the men stopped for a moment of silence. One removed his cap. "We dig," he said quietly, "because someone once dug for us." By the end of that week, the city's heartbeat had returned in the sound of their shovels. They cut narrow roads through the snow, linking the living to one another again. People began to follow in their paths, mothers, fathers, survivors clutching blankets and bread. From above, the city looked like a maze of white corridors lit by scattered fires, and in the center of it all, the men who dug for life kept working, their lanterns flickering against the frost, tiny flames defying a world of ice. When spring finally came and the last of the snow surrendered, those men were never named in the papers. Their hands healed into scars, their shovels rusted where they leaned them against the wall. But the tunnels they carved had given the city back its breath, and though no monument was ever raised for them, every thaw that followed was their memorial, the sound of ice breaking, the whisper of earth uncovered, the city breathing once more. By the 18th day, the thaw had begun, not gently, but with a slow, grinding relentlessness that turned the white city gray. The snow softened, sagged, and began to bleed. Drips of meltwater whispered from rooftops and gutters, running down walls like tears. For the first time in weeks, the smell of decay returned. It rose from the alleys, from the riverbanks, from beneath the drifts where the dead had waited. It crept into homes, into clothing, into breath. The blizzard's silence was over. In its place came the sound of water and mourning. The morgues filled first. At Bellevue, carts lined the courtyard, each stacked with bodies pulled from the ice. The attendants wore scarves soaked in vinegar and wrapped cloth around their boots to keep from slipping on the wet floors. They worked without speaking. The city's registers were useless now. There were no names, no records, only faces pale and waterlogged, their features softening as the ice released them. A man might carry in his brother and never recognize him. The bodies came faster than they could be counted. Police wagons and wheelbarrows brought them in from every district. The tenements, the frozen ferries, the alleys where people had collapsed in mid-step. When there was no more space inside, the attendants began stacking them outside along the fence, covering them with sheets that froze and thawed again. Reporters came and wrote that the hospital grounds looked like a field of shrouded stones. At the small parish morgues, the scene was worse. There was no ice left to preserve the corpses, and the stench made the priests retch at their altars. the nuns at street. Brigids tried to perform blessings for each soul, but by the 5th day they could no longer keep up. They wept as they worked, sprinkling holy water that froze as it fell. When asked how many lay inside, the Mother Superior simply whispered, "Too many to count and too cold to bury." City Hall sent word for the dead to be transported to vacant warehouses and breweries. The living obeyed. Men tied ropes around the ankles of corpses and dragged them across the slush, their boots sinking deep in the melt. The sound of wood scraping against ice filled the streets. In one warehouse near Washington Market, hundreds were laid out side by side, candles flickering along the aisles. Some volunteers prayed aloud. Others could only stand in silence, their breath clouding above the sea of faces. The newspapers did not print the worst of it. They called it a crisis of burial, as though the dead were a logistical inconvenience rather than the aftermath of catastrophe. But those who lived near the morgues never forgot the smell. They said it was sweet and sour at once, a perfume of sorrow that clung to their clothes and hair for years afterward. When the thaw deepened, the bodies began to move with the water slowly at first, then steadily, sliding down the sloped streets toward the rivers. The city scavengers built makeshift levees of crates and barrels to stop them, but each day more arrived. It was said that by dusk on the 19th day, the East River gleamed not just with melting ice, but with the reflections of white sheets drifting toward the tide. That night, the bells of St. Paul's rang for the first time since the storm. They tolled slowly, one note for each hour since the blizzard began. Those who heard them said the sound was both terrible and comforting, as if the city itself were finally confessing what it had kept buried. And when the last bell faded, the only sound left was the dripping of the thaw, steady, endless, like the world learning how to breathe again. By the 19th day, the city began to move again, not with its usual rhythm, but with the slow, desperate motion of the newly awakened. The thaw had loosened the snow into rivers of slush that ran down every street. Ice broke from rooftops and crashed to the cobbles below. People emerged from doorways and attic windows, blinking against the thin sunlight as though they had been underground for years. They were gaunt, filthy, and hollow-eyed, the survivors of the great blizzard, each one stepping into a city that no longer felt like home. They called themselves refugees, though there was nowhere to flee. The word came first from a group of dock workers who abandoned their frozen lodgings near the harbor and set out on foot toward Brooklyn, trudging through waist-deep snow along what used to be the East River Road. They carried what little they owned: blankets, kettles, scraps of bread tied up in bundles. Some pushed carts, others pulled sledges fashioned from doors. Behind them trailed families. The old and the sick carried on makeshift stretchers. The line stretched for blocks, a slow procession of the dispossessed. Crossing the bridges was impossible. The Williamsburg ferry had vanished, and the ice was too thin now to bear their weight. Some tried anyway. A man from Orchard Street led his wife and 2 sons onto the frozen river just after sunrise. They had made it halfway across when the ice moaned beneath them and split. The father pushed the boys forward, shouting for them to run. Only one reached the opposite shore. Those who stayed in Manhattan fared little better. The tenements were still half buried, and the wells were fouled with soot and debris. The air smelled of rot and smoke from the mass pyres burning along the riverfront. Bread was rationed, coal guarded by armed men. So people walked anywhere, nowhere seeking heat, food, or news of loved ones. Whole neighborhoods emptied into the streets, wandering between piles of rubble and frozen carriages, looking for an escape that didn't exist. Churches opened their doors, and so did warehouses, theaters, and railway sheds. The city's survivors crowded into these makeshift camps, wrapped in blankets, sleeping on floors slick with melting snow. Volunteers ladled out thin soup made from whatever could be found: salt, pork, onions, even melted snow flavored with pepper to hide the taste. No one spoke much. Voices felt foreign in that new silence, as though language itself had forgotten how to exist. A reporter from The Sun walked among them, Writing by the flicker of a lantern, he described men who had once been bankers sleeping beside dock workers, widows sharing blankets with strangers, and children too weak to stand, being cradled by whoever had arms to hold them. He called them a city within a city, the nation's proudest metropolis reduced to a camp of beggars and saints. His words never reached print. The presses were still ruined. At night, the refugees lit fires in the streets. The flames reflected off the ice, creating the illusion of movement in the dark. Some sang hymns, their voices hoarse but steady. Others simply stared into the firelight, their eyes full of exhaustion and disbelief. For the first time, all of New York, rich and poor, immigrant and native-born, shared the same cold, the same hunger, the same silence. When the snow finally melted enough to reveal the stones of Broadway, people knelt and kissed them. The act was half prayer, half delirium. But even then, few returned to their homes. The city no longer felt safe, no longer alive. They said it wasn't the cold that broke them, but the stillness that followed the realization that the city they had known was gone, buried not by snow, but by the memory of how fragile everything truly was. Those who left would remember the blizzard as the day New York stopped pretending it could never fall. Those who stayed learned to live among its ruins, carrying on not because they believed the city would recover, but because there was nowhere else left to go. By the 20th night, exhaustion had settled over New York like a second frost. The survivors no longer fought the cold, they drifted through it, eyes vacant, limbs moving by memory alone. The city had become a graveyard of movement, figures wrapped in rags, leaning against walls, frozen mid-stride as though they had fallen asleep before the act of dying. Some did. The phrase, "the city that slept standing up," came from a policeman who patrolled Broadway and found a man upright in a doorway, his hat still on his head, a newspaper folded neatly under his arm. He touched the man's shoulder, and the body crumbled forward into the snow. By dawn, there were dozens like him, men and women, who had refused to lie down for fear they would never rise again. They simply leaned, closed their eyes, and drifted into the kind of sleep that forgets to end. Along the riverfront, workers kept their lanterns burning through the night as they dug out the piers. The air stank of brine and thawing rot. Men fell asleep against the masts of ships, their hands still clutching ropes. When morning came, the ropes were frozen solid around their fingers. In the open market at Chatham Square, the vendors who had once shouted over one another now sat silent behind their carts, wrapped in blankets, nodding in and out of consciousness. A few still held apples or loaves in their hands, as if waiting for customers who would never return. Inside the churches, people slept in the pews, their heads resting on folded arms. The priests moved quietly among them, lighting candles that burned until the wax ran down and froze in the cold. Even prayer had slowed to murmurs. At street marks, one nun whispered, "They sleep because they no longer know they've survived." The city's few remaining doctors called it storm exhaustion. The body, they said, could only resist for so long before it shut itself down, but others thought it something deeper, an act of surrender. After 10 days of fighting for warmth, for food, for breath, the survivors had nothing left to give. Sleep became the only mercy the storm allowed. The trains still lay dead on their tracks, but the tunnels beneath Grand Central had filled with refugees seeking shelter. They sat in rows along the walls, huddled over dying lamps. Some spoke softly of their lives before the storm of summers in Coney Island, of picnics in Central Park, of carriages rolling through the night. Their words drifted upward like smoke, fading before they reached the vaulted ceiling. Above them, on the streets, the city's rhythm had slowed to something dreamlike. Men shoveled without purpose. Horses stood still and did not flinch at the touch. Even the bells that had cracked from cold rang slower, their tones dragging through the frozen air. It was as if time itself had decided to rest. And then, just before dawn on the 21st day, the wind changed. It came not from the north, but from the sea, soft, damp, and almost warm. Windows fogged from the inside for the first time in weeks. The snow that had buried the city began to sink in on itself, sighing as it melted. Those who were awake felt the change and wept without knowing why. The blizzard had finally loosened its grip, but its hold on the people remained. Even as the sun rose and the ice began to retreat, many stayed where they stood, eyes closed, leaning into the light as if afraid to believe in it. The storm had ended, but the city still slept standing up, breathing shallowly, dreaming of spring. The morning that followed the 21st day arrived like a confession. The sun rose red and heavy through a sky scrubbed clean by the wind, casting a dull glow over a city that no longer resembled itself. The snow that had once been white now lay grey and pitted, streaked with soot and ash from hundreds of fires burned for warmth. The air smelled of wet iron and smoke. Streets that had vanished for weeks began to reappear, their stones slick and black beneath the thaw. For the first time since the storm began, water ran freely through the gutters. It sounded like weeping. The survivors came out slowly, blinking against the light. They looked like ghosts of themselves, faces gaunt, eyes rimmed in shadow. Some laughed when they saw the sun, not with joy but with disbelief. Others wept openly, the tears freezing on their cheeks before they could fall. They moved quietly through the ruins, not yet daring to speak above a whisper, as if words might shatter whatever fragile mercy had come. The city stank of rot and smoke. Along the curbs lay horses collapsed in their traces, their hides glistening wet in the thaw. Men with saws and ropes worked in silence to clear them away. The carcasses were dragged to the river and pushed into the water, where they drifted downstream among the broken ice. At every corner, heaps of debris rose higher than the windows, shattered shutters, splintered wagons, frozen barrels, and unrecognizable shapes covered in grey slush. The rich and poor met again that morning on equal ground. Fifth Avenue had fared no better than the Bowery. The mansion's windows were shattered, their marble steps slick with melted snow. On the sidewalks, servants and socialites shoveled side by side, their faces indistinguishable beneath soot and frost. A young heiress was seen carrying buckets of water to wash the marble floor of a chapel-turned-shelter. When someone asked her why, she only said, "Because I can still move." At City Hall, a crowd gathered around the mayor as he stepped outside for the first time since the blizzard began. His voice trembled as he addressed them, promising aid, promising that the city would rise again. But his words were carried off by the wind, and few stayed to listen. People had learned to trust actions over speeches, warmth over hope. They left him standing on the steps, alone in his fine coat, while they returned to the work of survival. That day, thousands began to dig, not for rescue anymore, but for reckoning. They cleared paths between buildings, shoveling not just snow but memory, the places where loved ones had fallen, where carriages had frozen mid-turn, where fires had burned themselves out. Each shovel strike was an act of defiance, a small resurrection. By afternoon, the sound of water filled the air again, meltwater dripping from roofs, streams running through alleys. It was a sound no one recognized at first, so long had silence ruled. But soon the rhythm of it spread, echoing through the city like the faintest heartbeat returning. At sunset, the survivors stood at the edges of the harbor, watching the ice drift out to sea. The water gleamed bronze in the fading light, carrying away pieces of the blizzard-broken planks, frozen ropes, the remnants of a world buried and reborn. For a moment, no one spoke. Then an old dockhand removed his cap and whispered, "She's breathing again." And she was. Slowly, painfully, New York was beginning to wake, not as she had been, but as something older, humbler, and wise with loss. The storm had passed, but its shadow would remain. It would live in the cracks of the walls, in the silence between footsteps, in the faces of those who had seen the city stop and start again. The morning after was not an ending. It was the first hesitant page of something new, written in meltwater and memory. By the 22nd day, when the sun at last had strength enough to soften the city's scars, the living began to count the dead. It was a grim arithmetic that stretched from dawn to dusk, names written on scraps of damp paper, marks tallied in ledgers already stained with water and blood. No one knew where to begin. The police reports were gone, the hospitals overflowing, the records frozen in ruined drawers. So they counted with their eyes and their hands by faces, by initials carved on rings, by the faintest memory of a voice. The newspapers returned first, running on half-inked presses salvaged from flooded basements. Their headlines trembled as if ashamed. 200 dead, 400 missing, 800 lost. Each edition contradicted the last. Numbers rose with every sunrise. By evening, the figures no longer mattered. The dead had become uncountable, scattered between streets and rivers, tenements and churches. The editors stopped trying to measure tragedy and began printing the names of the found instead, the living as newsworthy as miracles. At City Hall, clerks huddled around long tables, taking testimony from whoever still had a story to tell. A woman from the docks spoke of her husband, last seen leading a horse through the snow. A boy carried a frozen glove and said it belonged to his father. Immigrant families arrived with papers written in foreign tongues, whispering prayers in languages the officials didn't understand. The clerks nodded, wrote what they could, and moved to the next. Their pens scratched like insects through the endless silence. Bodies were laid out in makeshift morgues, schoolhouses, theaters, breweries, each marked by a number instead of a name. Friends wandered through rows of the dead, lanterns in hand, lifting sheets with the quiet dread of recognition. In the old Bowery Hall, someone began keeping a list on the wall itself, scrawling names in charcoal until the plaster filled edge to edge. Beside each name, they left a small mark. A cross for found, a circle for lost. By week's end, the wall was black with grief. Priests moved between the morgues like shepherds in a field of snow, murmuring blessings over strangers. At St. Patrick's, the bell that had cracked during the storm was rung once for every 50 souls. Its broken tone carried far into the night, a sound both mournful and resolute. The living stopped their work to listen. Each strike reminded them not of who had died, but of who remained. And yet, for all the solemn record-keeping, some refused to believe the count. "It can't be so many," said the mayor, his voice hollow. "New York is too strong." But those who had walked the tunnels and the docks knew better. They had seen the children frozen in their classrooms, the policemen beneath the drifts, the sailors in the harbor's glassy tomb. Strength had meant nothing to the snow. By the month's end, the official tally stood at 412. Unofficial whispers placed it at over 1,000. Both numbers were lies of comfort. The truth, buried with the storm, belonged only to the city itself. Years later, when the world remembered the blizzard of 1888, the figures would shrink and blur in history books. But for those who lived through it, the count of the lost could never be reduced to a number. It lived in the faces of those who wandered too long after, still searching the thawing streets for someone who might appear again, one shadow among the many erased by snow. And on quiet spring mornings, when the wind blew through the narrow lanes and lifted a bit of old frost from the stones, people said you could still hear the tally being whispered, not in words, but in breath. A city keeping its own ledger, line by line, of all it had once held and all it had been forced to let go. By the 23rd day, the city had begun to thaw, but the thaw brought new cruelties. Water was everywhere and nowhere. The snow had melted into rivers that flooded basements and cellars, yet the wells that once nourished the city remained sealed with ice. Men smashed at them with hammers, chisels, and crowbars, striking sparks that died on contact. Beneath their blows, the ice only deepened, layer upon layer, hard as iron. The water was trapped below, mocking them from its frozen tomb. At first, people gathered at public pumps, their buckets clattering against the cobbles. They waited in long, shivering lines, hoping that the sound of running water might return. But the handles would not move. The pipes inside had burst days earlier, splitting under the cold. When someone tried to pour hot water over them, the steam rose in a hiss and then froze again before it touched the ground. The city's most basic lifeline, clean water, had turned to glass. Thirst joined hunger. Those who still had stoves melted snow, but the runoff tasted of soot and coal dust, blackened from the city's burning debris. Some strained it through cloth, others drank it as it was, ignoring the grit. Sickness soon followed. At the hospitals, the doctors, already starved of medicine, watched with despair as patients came in with stomach cramps and fevers. "It's the melt," one nurse whispered. "The storm's poison is running through us now." In the tenements, families rationed what little they had saved in barrels before the blizzard. They drank by the spoonful, giving the last drops to the children. A mother on Rivington Street was found rocking her infant, a cup of ice in her lap, waiting for it to melt enough to wet the baby's lips. She sang softly to keep from crying. Uptown, where the wealthy had cisterns on their rooftops, the story was the same. Servants climbed ladders to hack through the frozen reservoirs, carrying the chunks downstairs in buckets. But even the purest water turned foul as it thawed, thick with soot that had fallen from the city's fires. The rich learned that privilege could not melt ice any faster than prayer could. By the 5th day of thaw, desperate measures began. Men broke into breweries and distilleries, raiding casks of beer and gin to stave off thirst. In the Bowery, people drank melted snow mixed with lamp oil, believing the oil would keep the sickness away. Churches opened their fonts, offering holy water until it ran dry. One priest dipped his hand into the basin and found it frozen to the wrist. The newspapers called it the Second Blight. They warned of disease spreading through the runoff and urged citizens to boil their water, an absurd command in a city where firewood had already vanished. Still, people tried. Pots of blackened snow steamed on every surviving stove, filling the rooms with the acrid scent of metal and ash. Then, one morning, a sound returned that many had forgotten: the creak and groan of moving water. A single pump near Union Square began to flow again, thin at first, then steady. People ran from blocks away, carrying whatever they could find: bottles, pans, hats. They filled them greedily, crying with relief. The water was brown and warm from the earth, but it was life. That night, someone carved into the pump's wooden frame with a pocket knife, "God still hears." The words remained there for years, faint beneath the varnish of use. But the wells did not all surrender so easily. Across the city, the ice lingered deep underground, glinting like mirrors in the lantern light of the men who dug for it. Some said it was the storm's heart, that it would never fully melt, only retreat into the veins of the earth, waiting for another century to rise again. And when the wind blew through the empty pipes at night, it carried a hollow, humming sound like breath frozen mid-prayer. By the 24th day, the storm's aftermath had turned from tragedy to commerce. Fire, once so common that people took its warmth for granted, had become the most precious commodity in New York. Not gold, not bread, not water fire. The very thing that had once destroyed neighborhoods was now the only proof that life still existed. The city's heart beat not in its churches or halls, but in the scattered glow of coals flickering behind shuttered windows. The first to profit were the coal merchants. Their stores had survived the storm better than most. The thick stone walls had trapped their stock beneath layers of frost but kept it dry. When word spread that a few cellars still held barrels of anthracite, the desperate began to gather. At first they begged, then they bargained, soon they threatened. The merchants hired guards, men armed with shovels and pistols, to stand watch over what had become black treasure. A small sack of coal that had once sold for $10 now cost $1, then $5, then $10. Some paid with jewelry, others with heirlooms. A few offered themselves in service or trade. Near Mulberry Street, one widow exchanged her wedding ring for a single shovelful, enough to keep her stove alive until dawn. "It's worth it," she told the merchant, her hands trembling as she lifted the coal from the sack. "It means my children will dream warm tonight." But not all trades were so clean. Gangs began to roam the streets after sunset, raiding supply yards and robbing delivery wagons. They called themselves fire thieves, though they rarely lived long enough to enjoy their spoils. Fights broke out over scraps of wood torn from fences or the remains of burned furniture. One night on the Bowery, a man was killed for half a candle. His attacker was later found frozen in the same spot, the wick still clutched in his hand. The wealthy fared little better. Their mansions had chimneys but no coal. Their stoves burned only as long as their furniture lasted. Entire libraries were sacrificed to the flames, ledgers, diaries, even rare volumes bound in calfskin. A banker on Fifth Avenue was seen feeding family portraits into his hearth. "They can warm us one last time," he reportedly said before the glass shattered from the heat. At the factories along the East River, the few furnaces that still roared became havens. Workers slept beside them in shifts, taking turns stoking the flames. The owners charged admission 5 cents for 10 minutes of warmth. Men and women lined up in the slush, waiting for their turn to hold their palms over the fire, faces wet with melting snow and tears. When one furnace cracked from the strain, the explosion scattered burning coals into the night, igniting the wooden scaffolds nearby. For the first time since the storm, flames rose high enough to light the city's skyline. People cheered without realizing they were celebrating destruction. By week's end, the mayor ordered that coal be rationed under guard, but the decree came too late. The city had already turned against itself. The streets were full of smoke again, though this time it came from hearths, not riots from hope as much as hunger. And yet, amid the chaos, small acts of grace flickered. In one bakery, its roof half collapsed. The owner kept the oven burning day and night, using the last of his fuel to bake bread for the neighborhood. He refused payment, saying only, "If I stop, the fire dies, and so does the street." When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, the neighbors took over the oven in silence, feeding it scraps of wood and prayers. By the month's end, the snow was nearly gone. The streets glistened with soot and mud, but the fires still burned, steady and defiant. The city, scorched and humbled, had learned the true cost of warmth. Fire was no longer just survival, it was faith itself, burning against the memory of ice. By the 25th day, the city had begun to speak again. The telegraphs were not yet alive, the post still crippled, but words found their way through other means: penciled scraps of paper, ink blots on salvaged envelopes, charcoal written on wrapping cloth, letters carried by hand, exchanged in markets, slipped under doors, pinned to lampposts. After 3 weeks of silence, the living had rediscovered the need to tell someone, anyone, that they were still here. The first letters were simple: alive, safe, still breathing, names scrawled without addresses, left on church steps and fences, fluttering in the thawing wind. Children drew pictures of their families and left them at the corners where the snow was still high. Tiny messages to no one in particular. Lovers wrote on the backs of burned hymn sheets, promising they would find each other when the river melted. Some messages reached their destinations. Most did not, but it didn't matter. The act of writing had become its own proof of existence. At the General Post Office, the clerks returned to their ruined desks. They sorted what they could salvage, spreading damp letters across tabletops to dry. The smell of mold and ink filled the air. They read fragments aloud to keep their spirits from breaking. "We heard the bells again last night, still cracked but brave. The baby is weak but warm. The snow is melting over father's grave." They could not bear to destroy them, even when the pages fell apart between their fingers. Newspapers, too, began to print the words of the survivors. Columns titled "Letters from the Blizzard" appeared in the Herald and the Sunday. One woman wrote from her parlor on 10th Street, "The storm took our roof and our courage, but the piano remains, and I play each night to remind myself that music can live where walls do not." Another letter, unsigned, came from a dock worker. "I buried my friend under the snow beside the river. When it thaws, I will dig him out and give him his name." Again. The editors printed every word without correction. The blizzard had stripped away grammar, pride, and pretense. Only truth was left. In the poorer wards, where paper was scarce, people wrote on anything they could find: newspaper margins, flour sacks, fragments of wallpaper torn from their own homes. Children carried them from door to door like errand runners between the living and the lost. A little girl named Ada was said to have walked half the city, delivering letters folded into matchboxes. When asked why she did it, she simply said, "Because I can still walk." By week's end, the letters multiplied faster than they could be read. They gathered in piles at every church and relief station, like snowdrifts made of hope. Some were nailed to boards, forming long walls of handwriting. People stood before them, as if reading scripture. Strangers found each other, their neighbors who had thought one another dead. Families reunited by a single line written in a shaking hand. Among the countless letters recovered from that month, one became legend. It was found on the steps of Trinity Church, written in faded ink on a torn sheet of ledger paper. It read, "To whoever finds this, I am alive, though I feel I've died and begun again. If you are reading this, so are you. Let's agree to call that enough." The author was never identified, but copies of the note spread through the city. It was printed in papers, carved into wooden signs, even scratched onto lampposts by boys with penknives. Those 7 words, "Let's agree to call that enough," became the quiet refrain of the thaw. In a city where thousands had perished, the letters from the survivors were not just messages, they were resurrection. They told the story of a people who had walked through white silence and emerged changed, smaller, humbler, but still capable of words, still capable of reaching for one another. And long after the last drift melted into the river, those letters remained the Feyings, to city's truest monument to itself, inked in human endurance. By the 26th day, the thaw came in earnest. It did not arrive gently, like forgiveness, but violently, like the breaking of a spell. The temperature rose by 10 degrees overnight, and the city awoke to the sound of dripping millions of small rivulets pouring from eaves, from chimneys, from the empty sockets of broken windows. The world was dissolving around them. What had been white and still for 3 long weeks was now shifting, creaking, and groaning back to motion. The streets ran with rivers the color of slate, gutters overflowed, sewers gurgled as if clearing their throats after a long silence. The air itself was alive again, full of scent and sound, the acrid smell of soot, the salt of the harbor, the faint sweetness of decay. The thaw revealed everything the snow had hidden: toppled fences, cracked rails, collapsed roofs, and bodies that had waited quietly beneath their white shrouds for the sun to find them. Children were the first to step outside without fear. They splashed through the water running down the alleys, laughing as the ice sheets broke beneath their boots. To them, the storm was already a story. To their parents, it was still a wound. Men shoveled slush into carts and watched it melt before their eyes. Women stood at the windows with their sleeves rolled up, washing the frost from the glass, revealing faces that seemed older than the season allowed. Down by the harbor, the river began to move again. The ice groaned, split, and rolled outward in massive slabs. The frozen ships that had been trapped for weeks shifted with the tide, shedding their crusts of white. When the first one broke free, a small ferry called the Clara B, that its bell rang as it moved, a clear, pure note that echoed across the bay. People on the shore wept at the sound, though few could explain why. But with the thaw came the reckoning. The melting snow carried the city's dead back into view. In the gutters, in the fields, in the river itself, faces and limbs emerging from the retreating ice. The morgues overflowed anew, and wagons rolled through the streets, gathering what the storm had buried. The newspapers printed polite phrases, recovery efforts, clearing operations, but everyone knew what they meant. The storm had taken more than anyone dared to say aloud, yet for all the sorrow, the thaw felt like resurrection. The bells rang again, cracked but clear. Windows were opened. The smell of smoke gave way to the scent of wet wood and earth. In the parks, robins returned, picking through the mud for worms. One morning, a child shouted from Union Square that he'd found a crocus blooming beside the fence, its purple petals trembling in the cold air. People came from blocks away just to see it. They stood in a circle around the tiny flower, hats in hand, saying nothing. In the churches, priests spoke of deliverance, though their sermons were softer now, stripped of grandeur. "We were tested," one said, "and we are smaller for it, but smaller things bend where great things break." The city listened, but no one truly celebrated. They worked, they rebuilt, they swept the streets, they burned the refuse of the dead, and they kept their eyes on the sky, half expecting it to betray them again. By the week's end, the last of the ice floated out to sea, carrying splinters of wood, torn cloth, and fragments of the old city with it. On the docks, men watched it go until it vanished into the grey horizon. One of them murmured, "She's clean again." But even as they said it, they knew it wasn't true. The thaw had not erased the storm. It had only uncovered the shape it left behind. And when the night fell, and the water lapped gently against the piers, some swore they could still hear the ice groaning beneath the surface, like the faint memory of a voice that refused to be forgotten. By the 27th day, when the streets were mostly clear and the carriages began to move again, the city turned to the matter of blame. The blizzard had passed, but the anger remained. Men needed someone to hold accountable for the ruin. The thousands of dead, the frozen trains, the failures of communication, the hunger that had hollowed a proud metropolis into silence. So, the hearings began. They were held in the great chamber of City Hall, beneath a ceiling still veined with water stains. The officials who presided over them wore heavy coats, their breath visible in the cold air that lingered even now. The benches were packed with citizens, dock workers, clerks, widows, and reporters, all waiting to see who would answer for the storm. Outside, a crowd gathered on the steps, their boots thick with mud, their faces pale with exhaustion. The first to testify were the railroad men. The lines, they said, had done everything possible. The trains were strong, the engines reliable. It was the snow too heavy, too fast, too relentless. No steel could fight such a sky, one engineer said. But the council pressed him. Why had the trains not been stopped before the bridges failed? Why had passengers been sent north when warnings came from Philadelphia and Trenton? The engineer hesitated. The truth was simple. No one had believed the storm would be so cruel. "We thought it would blow over," he murmured, staring down at his gloves. It always had before. Next came the telegraph companies, accused of letting the city fall silent without warning. Their spokesman brought ledgers and diagrams, explaining how the wires had frozen, how the poles had snapped like reeds in the wind. It was an act of God, they said, their words practiced and hollow. The phrase echoed through the hall like a shield. Act of God. It excused everything and explained nothing. The mayor sat in silence through most of it. His face was drawn, his eyes red. When he finally spoke, it was not to defend but to confess. "We were not ready," he said simply. "Not the city, not its people, not its leaders. We built our towers and our trains and believed ourselves greater than the weather. We forgot that we live on the edge of the sea." His words were met with silence, then with slow applause from the back of the room, though no one was sure if it was praise or pity. Outside, the press swarmed the witnesses. The newspapers would call it the Great Blizzard Inquiry, though the verdicts were already known before the ink dried. Blame was scattered like ashes, some on the railroads, some on the Weather Bureau, some on the arrogance of progress itself. None of it brought the dead back. In the days that followed, committees formed, reports were written, and recommendations drafted. Underground telegraph lines, better warnings, stronger bridges, promises made in the language of hindsight. But the people knew better. They had seen how quickly the city's systems could crumble, how easily pride froze into helplessness. They had learned that no decree could protect them from nature's indifference. At night, the empty shell of City Hall still glowed faintly from the lamps left burning. The same lamps that had failed them during the storm now stood as symbols of renewal. Passers-by looked up at the light through the fogged windows and muttered, "They think they can outlast winter now." And yet, for all the cynicism, something had shifted. The hearings were not only about blame, they were the city's way of remembering together. To name the mistakes was to acknowledge survival. The inquest became a ritual of penance, a public confession whispered in the language of bureaucracy. When the proceedings ended and the last gavel fell, the crowd stepped into the thawing streets. The sky above was streaked with red from the setting sun, and for a moment the city looked warm again. No one cheered, no one spoke. They simply walked home in silence, each carrying the unspoken truth that no council could record, that the storm had not been just an act of God, but an act of forgetting, and that memory itself would be the city's new law. By the 28th day, the inquest had ended, the graves were dug, and the streets ran clear again. But the storm had left more than wreckage, it had left memory, etched deep into the city's bones. The people of New York had begun to move forward, yet everywhere they turned, they were reminded of what the blizzard had taken and what it had revealed. Its lessons were not written in ink or policy, but in ice in the cracked walls, the empty door frames, the quiet way people now looked at the sky before stepping outside. The first lesson was humility. For years, the city had believed itself untouchable. Its bridges, its towers, its telegraphs proof that man had conquered nature. But the blizzard had humbled it. The grandest architecture, the finest inventions, the boldest claims of progress, all had been silenced by wind and snow. Engineers spoke of redesigning their bridges with new strength. Builders promised deeper foundations. Yet, even as they spoke, they rubbed their hands together for warmth, the memory of frost still biting through their gloves. The second lesson was connection. During the storm, when telegraphs fell and newspapers stopped, people had rediscovered what it meant to depend on one another. Neighbors who had never exchanged a word before shared bread, blankets, and silence. In the days after the thaw, those same neighbors nodded to each other on the street like old friends, bound by the knowledge that they had survived together. There were stories of strangers who had broken into homes to save children, of shopkeepers who gave away the last of their flour. Such moments became the true currency of recovery. The third lesson was vigilance. The new Weather Bureau, rebuked for its blindness, vowed never again to underestimate a storm. Instruments were recalibrated, reports standardized, warnings drafted, underground telegraph wires were planned to protect against future ice. The city council approved the installation of steam lines beneath the avenues, the earliest dream of what would one day become the subway proof that even tragedy could seed invention. But every new plan began with the same phrase, never again caught unprepared. Still, no system could repair the damage to trust. There was a quiet fear, now a superstition that crept through the city like a chill. Mothers taught their children to read the wind, to listen for the strange hum that had preceded the storm. Sailors refused to sail when the river went still. Even the priests paused in their prayers when the sky turned white. The blizzard had made believers of them all, not in divine wrath but in nature's indifference, and yet, beneath the sorrow, a certain tenderness grew. People noticed the small things again, the sound of dripping water, the smell of fresh bread, the feel of sunlight on thawed stone. These were not luxuries now, but miracles. On the first truly warm morning of April, an old woman was seen standing in the middle of Broadway, eyes closed, her hands outstretched to catch the sun. When asked what she was doing, she replied, "Learning the warmth again." In the libraries and schools, the storm became lesson and legend. Teachers told their students how a city of iron and ambition had been undone by snow. Painters captured it on canvas, their brushstrokes soft and mournful. Writers filled columns and diaries with descriptions of white silence and black sky, of courage and collapse. The storm ceased to be an event, it became a parable. By summer, the scars had begun to fade, but the lessons remained. Beneath every street newly paved, beneath every beam newly set, the city carried the memory of its undoing. It whispered through the pipes and cables, through the whine of wind in the narrow lanes. Remember the cold, respect the storm, and in a way the people did. For years afterward, when the first flakes of winter began to fall, shopkeepers nailed their shutters early, children hurried home, and the bells of the churches rang softer, as if afraid to wake what still slept beneath the snow. By the 29th day, spring had begun to breathe through the cracks of the battered city. The streets were slick with rain instead of meltwater, and smoke no longer clung to every corner. But New York was not the same city that had existed before the storm. Its face was familiar, yet altered the way a man looks after surviving illness or war, his eyes deeper, his step slower, his pride tempered by remembrance. The blizzard had not just broken buildings, it had broken certainty, and in doing so, it had forced the city to begin again. Reconstruction started in silence. There were no parades, no proclamations. Instead, there were workers, thousands of them, clearing rubble, hauling beams, laying new tracks. The city that had been buried in white now pulsed with the black grit of coal, smoke, and effort. Brick by brick, it rose from its own ruin. The scars were everywhere, on the walls, in the streets, in the faces of the people who had seen too much cold to ever look at winter the same way again. Yet each act of rebuilding was an act of defiance, a whispered vow that the storm would not be the last word. In the wake of the disaster, new laws were passed. The telegraph lines, once strung above the streets like spiderwebs, were ordered underground, away from wind and ice. The city's power was to be buried hidden, safe, and steady. Railways followed suit, their planners dreaming of tunnels that would one day carry trains beneath the streets, safe from snow and frost. Out of devastation came vision, the beginning of modern New York. Public services, too, were reborn. A new weather bureau rose from the embarrassment of the old, its offices filled with young men who swore never again to dismiss the sky. They studied pressure, clouds, wind, and the strange electricity that danced before a storm. Telegraph operators in far-off cities promised faster warnings, linked by new underground cables. Even the mayor's office installed a special line reserved for weather. Alerts, a concession that pride could no longer afford to ignore. For ordinary citizens, change came slower, but deeper. The blizzard had taught them to look at one another differently. In tenements and brownstones alike, people began keeping extra loaves of bread, extra coal, extra blankets, not for themselves, but for whoever might need them next time. The concept of neighbor had stretched beyond fences and class. In church pews, factory lines, and market stalls, the same stories were told, of strangers who shared fire, of hands that dug through snow to pull others free. The storm had stripped the city of its vanity, but given it something harder to name, a kind of collective conscience. Children born that spring grew up hearing the blizzard spoken of in hushed tones. Their parents would point to the iron lampposts bent by wind, to the trees along Broadway still scarred by ice, and say, "That was the year the city changed forever." To them it was history. To their parents, it was still an open wound. And for all its suffering, New York did not forget its beauty. Artists painted the storm in shades of silver and blue, their canvases capturing both terror and awe. Poets wrote of white silence swallowing the world, of men and women who found themselves small and holy beneath it. The newspapers, once filled with death counts, began to print stories of rebirth. The first ferry to cross the river again, the first train to move north, the first spring wedding held after the thaw. By autumn, the city glowed again at night. New gas lights lined the avenues, brighter than before, their reflections trembling in puddles where the snow had once towered. But now, when the wind howled through the alleys, people listened. The blizzard had become a presence, a ghost woven into the rhythm of life. And so the city learned its final lesson, that progress is not the absence of danger, but the decision to build anyway. The year 1888 would forever divide time in New York, the storm and after it. Everything that came next, the subways, the underground wires, the vigilance of its people, would be born from those frozen days when the city was humbled and remade by the mercy and cruelty of nature alike. They called it the year the city changed forever. And they were right. The blizzard had not ended New York, it had forced it to become what it was always meant to be. A city that remembers, endures, and begins again. By the 30th day, the blizzard had become a story. Not yet history, not yet myth, but something hovering between memory and dream. The snow was long gone, carried off by the river and the sea, yet its echo lingered in the air, in the hush that came before rain, in the pale breath of winter mornings, in the way people paused at the sound of distant wind. The city was alive again, but quieter somehow, as if it had learned reverence. New York, which had once measured time in the roar of carriages and the clang of industry, now remembered the sound of silence. The survivors spoke of that silence as though it were a living thing. It had weight, they said, and temperature. It was the stillness between one heartbeat and the next, the moment before a prayer becomes a cry. Those who had walked through it could never forget. Shopkeepers still swore that, in the small hours, they sometimes heard the muffled creak of falling snow, though no flakes touched the window panes. Mothers, waking suddenly in the night, would imagine the faint rattle of a shutter, the soft moan of wind pressing against the walls. The storm had ended, yet it lived on in nerves, in dreams, in the unspoken knowledge that nature had once closed her hand around the city and nearly refused to let go. As spring ripened into summer, the memory refused to fade. Men working along the docks paused to watch the river, still expecting to see the ghostly outline of frozen ships. Children skipped stones and wondered aloud whether the ice might come back if they were unlucky enough to wish it. Even in laughter, there was restraint. Even in warmth, an awareness of how quickly warmth could vanish. The blizzard had been their shared crucible. It had changed not only how they built their city, but how they understood their own fragility. Writers began to shape it into words. The papers printed memoirs of the Great White Silence, as one poet called it. Painters captured it in strokes of grey and silver, showing not the chaos of snow, but the eerie stillness that followed the city buried beneath its own breath. In parlours and taverns, old men told younger ones, "You cannot imagine what quiet truly is until you've heard it after the wind stops." The phrase caught on. People repeated it for years as both warning and wisdom. Yet not all memories were grim. Some recalled the small mercies the storm had uncovered, the neighbor who shared his bread, the stranger who lit another's fire, the songs sung by candlelight while roofs groaned overhead. The blizzard had stripped the city bare, and in that nakedness, something true had been seen, that survival was not merely endurance, but communion. Every March thereafter, when the first cold wind swept down from the north, the city paused. People shut their windows, lit their stoves, and listened. They did not fear the snow so much as they acknowledged it, as one might a ghost that keeps its distance. Children would ask their parents about the storm, and the parents would smile faintly and say, "That was the winter the world stopped breathing." And somewhere in those retellings, half history, half prayer, the blizzard became more than weather. It became a measure of memory itself, proof that even silence can scar, and that from the coldest season, something enduring is always born. When the last witnesses died, decades later, their descendants found the old journals, the letters warped by damp, the drawings of white streets beneath a vanished sky. They read them by lamplight and felt, for a moment, that same hush settle over them, the hush of a city held between life and death, listening for the first thaw. That was how the great blizzard of 1888 lived on, not as disaster, but as reminder. The city had survived by learning to listen, to bend, to remember. And though the snow never returned with such fury again, the people of New York carried its silence within them, like a hidden pulse beneath the noise of progress. Because the storm had not truly ended, it had merely stepped aside, leaving behind its echo the white silence that waits, eternal and patient, in the heart of every winter.